This is a wee story for Rackwick and Hoy, and it's called The Watch. Now there was a man called Peter Maud who lived in Rackwick, and he was down in Longhope on business one day, and he was taking the route back along the cliffs. Now as he was walking near the edge of the cliffs, he got to a place called the Geo Heads, and there he saw two men walking towards him, and they were dressed in fishermen's clothes. And the one man stepped forward to him and he said, "Excuse me, do you have the time?" Peter took out his pocket watch and opened it and told him what the time was. The stranger stared at Peter's watch and he said, "Where did you get that watch?" "I bought it in Wick," he said, "when I was at the fishing there." "Why?" "If you open the back of that watch," said the stranger, "you will see the numbers 33707 carved into the back of that." "Well, I don't know," said Peter. I didn't know that the back opened." "Look." So he opened it up, and sure enough, just as the man said, there was the numbers 33707. "How did you know that those numbers were there?" asked Peter. "It's my watch," said the man, "and my corpse is lying at the foot of this geo. I was drowned and washed ashore there. Now a man from Longhope found my body, and he took my watch, and he sold it in Wick when he was at the fishing there himself. But he became too scared to retrieve my watch chain. I have a gold watch chain in my waistcoat pocket, but he didn't take that. Now, you bought that watch in good faith. You didn't know its history. And so, I am more than happy for you to have it, but I would like you to do something for me. Take a boat around and recover my body, and give me a decent Christian burial. If you will do that for me, you can have the golden watch chain as your payment, and you will never want for anything after that. Good luck and fortune will walk with you. But if you refuse to do this, then you will have no peace either day or night." And with that the two men disappeared. Well, Peter ran home as fast as he could, and he was scared. He didn't want to go and find the skeleton of this poor man. But at the same time, he was more afraid of what would happen if he didn't do what the ghost asked him. So he spoke to a lot of the old men in the area, and they said, "You have no option, boy. You've got to go and do as he says, or you will have no peace from his haunting. We'll go with you." So a whole boatload of elderly men set off with the young man, with Peter, and they sailed around to the Geo Heads, and there, on a rock, on a shelf of rock above the sea, they found the body of the man, the fisherman. And, as I said, he was a skeleton now, really. But Peter recognized him because of the clothes that he was wearing. It was the same clothes as the man on the top of the cliff had been wearing. But now they were all tattered and torn, exposed to the elements. And so, very gently and very carefully, they took the man's body down into the boat. And, looking inside the waistcoat pocket, Peter found the gold watch chain, and he unclipped it, clipped it onto his watch, put it in his pocket. Now the body was taken back with great solemnity to Rackwick, and there a coffin was made for him, and the body was placed in the coffin. And then the men from Rackwick, they carried the coffin through the valley to the kirkyard that lies on the other side, quite a few miles away. But they carried him there, and there was a proper Christian service held over the gravesite. And then, after that, Peter never saw any more ghosts again, because the fisherman was at peace. This is a story from Orkney called Boray Isle. Now the island of Gershi rises out of the sea like a round hill, and it's a beautiful green little island, and it has many small islands scattered around it. We call them homes, which is just a small island. Now the second largest of the islands around there, the homes around Gershi, is called Boray. And this story happened there. A long time ago, there was a man called Harold of Gershi, and he lived on the island of Gershi, and he was a farmer and he was a fisherman. And one day he was out fishing, and the fishing was good, and he stayed out longer than he'd intended to. Now, it was summer. It was a nice night. It was starting to get dark. And so he started to row back. Now, as he drew near to the Isle of Boray, he heard music, the most wondrous music that he had ever heard in his life. And he wondered where that was coming from. And he could see groups of people, all finely dressed, all dancing on the shore. So he very carefully pulled his boat up and walked so that he wasn't seen by these strangers. He didn't know who they were, but he walked up to watch them, to see what they were doing. Well, they were all dancing to this beautiful music, but where the music came from, Harold had no idea, because there was no one there playing any instruments. It was like the music was created by magic. It just seemed to flow out of the sea itself. And there they danced, and there they laughed. And down by the shore he could see dark shapes lying. He went down to investigate what these shapes were, and he discovered that they were sealskins, empty sealskins that had been cast off and left there by the dancers. These were the Selkie folk. This was the night that they could come ashore and dance, and they would dance until the dawn. Well, one of the skins Harold took with him, and he put it in his boat, and he rowed out from the island for a short distance, and he waited there until the sunrise. And when the sun rose, the music stopped, and all the dancers ran down to their sealskins and pulled them on, and soon they were all swimming away in the sea as seals once more. All except for one figure. There was one person still standing on the shore, couldn't find the skin. Now Harold went back to see who this was. And when he got near the figure, and the figure turned round and looked at him, Harold got the shock of his life. "Hello, Harold," said her voice. "I see you have my skin." "Mother," he said, "Mother, how can it be you? You're dead. You died years ago. You were drowned." "Ah, son, it's true. But it is the fate of those who drowned to become Selkie folk. I am one of the seal people now, and I must go back to the sea. Give me my skin back, son. Let me go back home, where my home is now, I can have no other." "But mother," he said, "don't you want to come back and live with me?" "I cannot, son," she said. "I must return to the sea." "Well, I can't let you do that, mother. Please, son, give me back my skin." "No," he said, "no, I won't do it. I won't lose you again. I lost you before when I was just a boy. I can't lose you again now. It would kill me. It would be too much for me. I can't let you go. I can't lose you all over again." "Son, son, son. It's okay. It's all right. Please just give me back my skin, and in return, I will show you the skin of the most beautiful girl among all the Selkie folk, a girl that you will be proud to have as your wife, a girl who you will love beyond anything else." Well, Harold reluctantly agreed, and he handed the skin back to his mother. She went down to the shore. "Come back in 1 month's time," she said, "and I will be here waiting for you." And then she slipped on the sealskin and disappeared into the sea, back as a Selkie once more. Harold went home, and he waited for that month to pass. Oh, it was a long wait, but eventually the time passed, and it was the night when the Selkie folk can come ashore and dance, the one night of every month that they can take human form again, and not be seals, but be humans. And so he rowed back to the island. He could hear the lovely music playing again, just as it had been the month before. And there, standing apart from the rest of the dancers, was his mother. She went down to the shore, and she touched one of the skins. She looked at her son, and then, without another movement, without a nod of the head or anything, she turned around and walked back to the rest of the dancers. Harold went down to where the skin was, and he took it, and he ran back to his boat with it, and he rowed back to Guernsey, and he locked it in a chest, kept it safe where she wouldn't get it again. And then he waited. He waited until the sun rose, and he went back to the island. And there, standing on the shore weeping, was the most beautiful woman that he had ever seen in his life. She stood there, sobbing, wailing, and lamenting the loss of her skin. Harold came back and said, "Come home with me. Be my wife." "No," she said, "please give me my skin back. I must go back to the sea. I must go back to my father. He is a king among the Selkie folk. I beg you, please give me back my skin." "No, no," he said, "no. You must come with me and live on Guernsey and be my wife. I will love you, and I will treat you like a queen." She had no choice. She had to go back. And the two of them were married. And they lived very happily together, and they had several children. Now, during the time that she lived with Harold, she noticed that once a week he would take a book down from a shelf and open it, and he would read from it, quietly to himself. And she said, "What is this book that you read from every week?" "It's a Bible," he said. What's a Bible? Why, it's the teachings of my religion, my faith. Tell me about it. And he did. And he read her passages from it as well. She loved the stories, and she listened to it. And somehow it moved her in a way that she hadn't been moved before. And eventually, she said to him, "You know, we have no religion where I come from. But you talk about this thing, the soul that is in me. And I fear that I may not have one. May I become a Christian?" "Yes," he said. "I will fetch a priest, and we can have you baptized." "I'd like that," she said. And so he did. And she was baptized into the Christian religion. Now, time passed, and something started to happen. Harold didn't know why it was or how it happened, but, you know, it seemed to be on that night, the night that the Selkies could come ashore, the night that the Selkies could take human form. And the Selkie folk down on the shore on Boray would sing. And the song that they sang seemed to draw the life out of his wife. Every night that they sang, she grew a bit weaker. She grew a bit sadder, a bit more sorrowful. And she grew weaker and weaker, until in the end she said, "Harold, give me back my skin, and let me go home." "I can't do that," he said. "I can't lose you. I lost my mother. I'm not losing you as well. The bairns can't lose their mother. I know that pain, and I don't want them to suffer that." "Well," she said, "it does trouble me, but I will stay with you." Now, after a time, the more that the singing was going on, the more that the Selkie folk sang that song of enchantment, the life force was drawn out of the young woman. And she lay there the one night, and she said to her husband, "Tonight is the dancing night, and tonight is the night that I die. I want you to do one thing for me. I'm afraid." "I know you are," he said. "It's not death I'm afraid of. It's what happens after that. Will I have an immortal soul? Will I be allowed into heaven? Or will I be cast out into the darkness? I need to know. Take me back to the island. Wrap me in my sealskin and lay me on the shore. Now when the Selkie folk come back, they will try to take me away with them. But if my soul has been saved, then they will not have the power to do that." Well, he couldn't deny her this. And so he took the sealskin from the locked chest where he kept it, and he wrapped her in it, and he carried her down to the boat, and he laid her in the boat in the stern, and then he rowed over to the island, and he picked her up, and he carried her down to the shore where he had first met her, and he lay her gently down on the beach, and he wept, and he said goodbye to his beautiful Selkie wife. And then he went back to his boat, and he rowed out a distance from the island. and he stayed there all night with his head in his hands, weeping. Now he could hear the music start, and then there was a wail went up from the Selkie folk when they found her lying on the beach. Well, the nights in summer in Orkney are short, but to him it felt like the longest night of his life before the sun finally rose again, and he was able to go back to the island. He went back to where he left her, and she lay there, in exactly the same spot that he had placed her. And he knew then that her soul was saved because the Selkie folk couldn't take her away with them. And also, there was a smile on her face, cold and dead now though she was. There was a smile on her face that seemed to say that she was a soul at rest. And Harold, pained though he was, he knew that their parting would now not be forever. Now, any of you that are familiar with Orkney will know that there is a lovely little green island called Eynhallow, which lies between the island of Rousey and the mainland of Orkney. But that island wasn't always there, you know. It used to belong to the Finfolk. It was part of Hildeland, their magic islands that float on the surface of the sea, but it was won by magic many years ago. So this is the story, how the Finfolk lost Eynhallow. Now, there was a man called Thoradale, who lived in Evie, on the parish that of the north-west mainland that borders the shore, looking out towards Rousey. Now, in those days, there was no Eynhallow there at all. Now, this man, Thoradale, he was married and had 3 sons, who were now grown up. But his wife, sadly, she took ill and died. Now, after a while, Thoradale thought that he would marry again. He still wasn't that old a man. And there was a woman in the parish who was a great beauty. And he went and courted her, and asked her to marry him, and she agreed. Well, they had a wonderful wedding feast, and they were very happy together. The 2 of them loved each other very much. And also, the woman loved her stepsons as well, and they loved her too. Now, one day, Thoradale was down on the shore with his wife. They were gathering shellfish, and Thoradale sat down with his back to the sea, and he was tying his shoelace when he heard a scream. He sprang up onto his feet and turned around, and he could see that there was a Finn man down on the shore, and he had his wife clasped in his arms, and he was dragging her towards his boat. Well, Thoradale ran after him, but the Finn man threw her into the boat and jumped into it, and he pulled on the oars, and the boat shot across the surface of the sea, propelled by the Finfolk's magic. Well, Thoradale pushed his own boat down to the sea, and he was going to give chase, but it was too late. The Finn man and his boat was gone, out of sight. Well, Thoradale went back to the shore, and he was broken-hearted and furious, all of equal measure. And he took off his stockings, and he rolled his trousers up, and he went down on his knees on the shore, between high and low water, and he swore that one day he would get his revenge on the Finfolk. Alive or dead, he would have his vengeance. Well, he spent many a sleepless night wondering how he would get his revenge on the Finfolk, but he hadn't a clue. Now one day he was out fishing in the Rousey Sound, between Rousey and the mainland. Of course, there was no Eynhallow there. And as he was fishing, it was slack water, and he was just bobbing away on the surface of the sea with his fishing line out. And he heard a sound, singing, and a voice that he recognized. It was the voice of his wife who had been carried away by the Finman. And she sang a song that went, "Good man, greet no more for me again you'll never see. But if of vengeance you'd have joy, go spear the wise spae wife of Hoy." Well, what that meant was, "Good man, do not cry for me, for you will never see me again. But if you would enjoy vengeance, then go and ask the spae wife, the witch of Hoy, the island of Hoy." So he immediately headed back for the shore, pulled up his boat, went home, took his staff in his hand, and put silver in a stocking, and he walked, and then took a boat over to Hoy, and he found the spae wife, and he told her what had happened with the Finn man and his wife, and how he longed for vengeance on them. "The thing that you can do that will hurt them the most," said the spae wife, "was to deprive them of any part of Hildeland, their invisible islands. Now mortal eyes cannot see their islands, but I will teach you the method by which you can see the island, and the method of being able to win it and secure it as part of the Orkney Islands." So she told him, and he went home with knowledge. And the next night of the full moon, he went to the stones of Stennis. Now, next to the stones of Stennis, there used to be a stone called the Odin stone, which had a hole through it, a stone which had magical powers. Now, he went on his bare knees 9 times around the stone on the night of the full moon, and then looked through the stone, and he did that for 9 nights. On the night of the full moon, he would go 9 times around the stone and look through the hole, and at the end of the 9th night, he was shown how to see Hildeland. He was given that power, but only once. Only the one time could he see it. He went home and he prepared everything. He bought a quantity of salt, and he put it in a chest. And he got 3 cases, straw baskets that you wear on your back. And he told his 3 sons what they had to do when the time came. Now one morning, Thoradale woke up, and he went out, and he yawned and stretched. And he looked out over the sound towards Rousey, and there, lying in the middle of the sea, was a lovely little island, a lovely little green island that had never been there before. He shouted to his sons to make everything ready and to head down to the boat. They knew what to do. They got the cases and they filled them with salt, and the 3 of them headed down to the shore. They launched the boat and they set rowing towards the island. The 3 sons rowed, and Thoradale stood in the bow of the boat staring at that island, because he knew that if he took his eyes off that island just for a second, just for a moment, it would be gone, and he would never have the power to see it again. So he kept his stare fixed on that island. Now as they were rowing along, suddenly the sea around them was filled with whales, great huge whales. Now the sons said, "Father, We should try to drive some of these whales ashore, thinking of the money that they could make from the rendered-down blubber. The whale oil was an expensive commodity in those days. But the man said no, keep rowing, because he knew that this was just the magic of the Finfolk, used to conjure up an apparition. They weren't real, they were phantoms. Now, one of the whales, the biggest of the lot, lay between the boat and the island, which only Thoradale could see. And this whale slowly turned around, and it swam towards the boat with its huge mouth wide open, and the boys thought that it was going to swallow the boat with them in it, and they shouted to their father, but he paid no attention. He took a handful of salt from the nearest casey, and he threw it into the monster's mouth, and it disappeared. It was only the magic of the Finfolk, and salt can break the magic. Now they carried on rowing, and they were drawing near to the island, which again the boys couldn't see, but Thoradale could. And there on the shore was two of the most beautiful mermaids you'd ever seen in your lives, standing there with their silvery-coloured petticoats on, and they were naked from the waist up, and their long golden hair flowed down their backs and sparkled in the sun like spun gold, and they sang the most beautiful song. And as the boys heard it, they started to row slower and slower. They were in a dream, under the spell of the mermaids. Now Thoradale gave the nearest boys a kick, and said, keep rowing. And he shouted to the mermaids, take this, you unholy limmers. And he threw a cross at them. It was a cross made of tangles. That's the dried kelp stems, kelp seaweed. And he had fastened it together in the shape of a cross, and he threw it at the mermaids, and when they saw it, mermaids and Finfolk cannot bear the sign of the cross, and they screamed and jumped into the sea and swam away. Now the next thing that the boys knew was the boat had hit a beach, a gravelly beach. Now they could see the island. They hadn't been able to see it before, but now they could see it too. And Thoradale chomped out onto the shore and walked up onto the land, and there was a hideous monster. It was huge, with tusks as long as a man's arms, and feet as big and flat and round as millstones, and it spat fire from its mouth. But Thoradale took another handful of salt, and he threw it in the monster's face, and the monster disappeared with a low, terrible growl. And in its place was a Finn man with a naked sword in his hand. I know why you've come here, said the Finn man. You've come to steal land from the Finfolk, and if you don't go, I will defile the soil of Hildeland with your vile human blood. Well, when the sons heard that, they shouted, Father, come away! Come home, Dad! But he wasn't going anywhere. The Finn man lunged at him with a sword, trying to strike him in the breast with it to drive the sword into his heart. But Thoradale was too quick for him, and he jumped to one side, and he had another cross prepared, one made of cloggers, kind of sticky grass. And he threw it at the Finn man's face, and it stuck to his face, and it burned into his flesh. The Finn man cried out in pain, but he couldn't bear to pull the cross away, because if he touched it with his hands would be burnt too. He ran off screaming in pain. Well, Thoradale ordered his sons to get out the boat. They knew what to do. Now was time to act. So the three of them got a casey of salt on their backs, and they went around the island, sewing a ring each around the island, a ring of salt, all the way around Eynhallow. And they did that 3 times, the 3 of them. 3 times 3 rings of salt, 9 rings in all the way around Hildeland. And at the same time Thorondale cut 9 crosses into the turf of the island, which fixed it. Now the mermaids screamed, and the Finn men roared with rage and anger, and their beautiful blue cattle that grazed on the island, they bellowed out of them in panic. It sounded like the world was coming to an end, and they all ran pell-mell down the slopes of the island and into the sea and gone. Now, eventually, the boys finished their 3 rings of salt each all the way around the island. But not quite. You see, the youngest son had big hands, and he didn't finish that last ring of salt. And so there is still said to be magic on Eynhallow. It is said that no rats, cats, or mice can live on the island, and that if you tether an animal with an iron stake, as soon as the sun sets, the stake will chomp out of the ground. And if corn is cut after sunset on the island, the stalks will bleed. Now, people in Kirkwall used to take stones and bits of handful of soil from Eynhallow and put it under the doors of their houses, under the thresholds, to stop rats and mice from entering the house. I don't know if that works. I have thought at times about taking a handful of soil from Eynhallow and putting it in the cat's litter tray to see what would happen, but Rhonda won't let me. Now I'm going to tell you 2 stories about Orkney Shipwrecks. Now, over the centuries, of course, there has been many, many shipwrecks around Orkney. But there is 2 that has stories that I know and have always liked. Now, these are real events. These are real shipwrecks. And the first was a ship from Dundee called the Star. And it was wrecked on Wednesday, the 5th of March, 1834. Now the people at Uttertoun in Stromness were experiencing a terrible gale. A westerly gale was howling, and people stayed in their houses as much as possible because it really wasn't that safe to go out. But then the cry went up that a ship was being driven towards the Black Craig, a tall cliff. And sure enough, when the people ventured out of their homes, they could see a ship being driven towards the cliff, and not a thing could the crew do about it. Now, the people, desiring to try to help those on board, went out and got clues and clues of simon ropes. These are straw ropes, ropes made of twisted straw. And they're wound into a big ball called a clue. And these simmons were taken up to the top of the Black Craig, and by this time the ship was pinned up against the crag, and they could see right down onto the deck, and there were men running around all over the place, trying desperately to save themselves, but what could they do? So the Uttertoun folk started to lower these twisted straw ropes, these simmons, down in front of the cliff, down onto the deck of the ship, so that the folk on board, the crew, could climb up the rope or be dragged up on the rope to safety. But they'd hardly started their work when suddenly a huge wave rolled in from the Atlantic and smashed against the side of the ship with such ferocity that the ship was broken to matchsticks. Well, the crew, of course, were all in the sea now, and there was nothing that the out-of-tune folk could do to save them. Now, after a while, when it saw that all was hopeless, the folk sadly returned to their houses, and they stayed there. Now that was a Wednesday. The wind carried on blowing with the same ferocity for 4 days, and it didn't go down until the Sunday. Now, there was one house, which was the nearest to the Black Craig, and the people in the house were sitting there on the Sunday, minding their own business, when a stranger walked in. They didn't know who he was, and they sat him down by the fire. He was wet, he was very wet. So they got him some warm blankets, and they warmed up some milk for him to drink, and he sat there shivering by the fire. They built the fire up so that it would be hotter, with a bit more flame with it. And then he told them his story. He was the only survivor from that ship. What had happened was, when the wave struck the ship and splintered it to pieces, he was thrown into the sea, but the sea washed him into a big sea cave that is at the foot of the Black Craig. Now, he would have been killed in there, because the waves pounding in through that cave, they would have smashed him against the back wall of the cave. But it wasn't his day to die. Fate didn't have that in store for him on that day, because part of the ship's hull, a large section of timber, was wedged up against the mouth of the cave, and that stopped the worst of the waves from getting in. Now, he found himself with a bit more luck, because at the back of the cave there was a raised beach, so he was able to sit up on this rocky shore, away out of the water. And he also found that there was a small barrel of salt fish had been washed in there, along with a small barrel of ship's biscuits. And he had water to drink, because the water was trickling down through the rock and dripping from the roof of the cave. So he had a supply of fresh water as well. And what he did was, he just had to stay there and wait until the storm abated, so that he could get out of the cave. And he waited for the 4 days, until on the Sunday the seas were calm again, the wind had stopped howling, and he was able to climb up out of the cave over the wreckage of the ship. And then he discovered that his troubles weren't over, because he now had to climb quite a tall cliff. But he did. He climbed the cliff and managed to make it all the way up to the top, and then he headed towards the nearest house that he could find. He told them that his name was Charlie, that the ship, the Star of Dundee, was sailing from Wick to Bristol when they got caught in the storm. Well, he stayed there for a time until he regained his strength, and they were able to contact the ship owners and let them know what had happened. And he was able to leave Orkney and go back to Dundee to join his family, who of course had given him up for lost. But that man's name, Charlie, remains behind in Orkney. What happened to him after that? Well, this story doesn't tell. I don't know. But that cave that is at the foot of the Black Craig is still known to this day as Charlie's Hole. Now, the second story I'm going to tell you is about a ship called the Pennsylvania, a steamship sailing from New York to Copenhagen. Now, she was wrecked on the island of Swona on Monday, the 27th of July, 1931. Now, she was carrying quite a valuable cargo, a general cargo, but all things from chemicals to radio sets and typewriters and even several Cadillac cars. Now, it was foggy when they left New York, and to their horror, it didn't get any better. The entire crossing of the Atlantic was done in thick fog, and it was so thick that the captain of the ship was so worried that he stayed on the bridge of the ship for 93 hours straight without sleeping. Well, they came in to Orkney through the Pentland Firth, but then they must have drifted a bit too far north because they ended up on the island of Swana, on the rocks there, stuck fast. Now, being summertime, the sea wasn't rough. They just couldn't see the islands, couldn't see the skerry that it ended up on. Now, the Long Hope lifeboat was launched. The Long Hope lifeboat has a long and distinguished career. And that lifeboat was launched and set off towards the ship to take off the crew. But the captain ordered them in a rather blustering and unfriendly manner to return back to their base, because he wasn't leaving his ship. He knew that, of course, as soon as he left the ship, then it could be claimed for salvage. Now, the Long Hope lifeboat, having come out, they had to go back again. I can't imagine that they were terribly happy about that, but they stayed on board for a few more days until it was obvious that there was no way that they were ever going to be able to get that ship off the rocks, and also it was in danger of breaking its back and sinking. So they took to the ship's boats and they made it ashore. Now the customs men turned up, with the idea, of course, of keeping an eye on the wreck to stop anybody from liberating any of the cargo. But the thing is, when they got to South Ronaldsay and started making inquiries about a boat that could be hired to take them out to the ship to do an inventory of what was on board, well, there was always a reason why the South Ronaldsay folk couldn't take them out on the boat that day. I mean, it was either, the weather wasn't right, or the tide wasn't right, or, we don't have enough men. There was always an excuse, because the last thing that they wanted was for the custom men to get on board that ship, because they were helping themselves from the cargo. And they weren't alone either. I mean, people from the islands around about were also helping themselves. But so were the Stroma men. Now, Stroma is an island that lies in the middle of the Pentland Firth, and it actually belongs to Caithness. It's part of the county of Caithness. But the Stroma men had a reputation as wreckers. I don't mean putting up lights and luring ships onto the rocks, but stripping anything valuable off a ship as soon as it was on the rocks. They said that Stroma men could smell a shipwreck. Now, the Chona Groats men, from across in Caithness as well, were also in on the act. They were also famous for their ability to get on a wreck and remove anything of value. So it was being well picked over while the customs men were kicking their heels in South Ronaldsay, staring hopelessly across the water at this wreck, and not being able to set foot on deck. Now, it was starting to become obvious that the ship was in a bad way, and it wasn't going to be up on the rocks for much longer. It was starting to break up, and if it broke, then it would sink into deeper water, and that would be the finish of it. Now, there was a boat from South Ronaldsay set off, and they did it under the cover of, well, I can't say darkness, because, end of July, start of August, it's not really that dark at night. But it was under the cover of the gremlins, as we would say, at twilight, that they set off. Now, they couldn't show a light of any sort, either on the boat or on board the ship while they were going down into the holds, because the custom men back on South Ronaldsay would see that. They were watching that wreck like a hawk. So, in the darkness, they clambered on board, and they managed to get down into the hold, and they just took the first 2 big boxes that they could get their hands on. It was passed up to the deck and lowered down to the boat, and then the men made their escape. This was a dangerous thing to do, because that ship was just on the point of breaking up. But they felt it was worth the risk. So they took these 2 boxes containing they knew not what, and they headed back to South Ronaldsay, and they took it to a hiding place to stash it, so that the customs men wouldn't find it. And then it was time to open the box and see what was inside, see what treasures that they had managed to save from the deep. Now, they opened the box, and the first one that they opened contained shrouds. Shrouds for putting on dead bodies. So they opened the second one, and what was in it? Condoms. Now, this was not what they were hoping at all. The ship broke up very soon after that and disappeared into deep water. Now, the thing is, when I was hearing this story being told, on both sides of the Pentland Firth, depending on which side of the firth I was on, it was always the people on the other side that stole the shrouds and the condoms. The Chonagroats folk said, well, it was South Ronaldsay. And the South Ronaldsay folk said, Chonagroats men did that. But the cat was let out of the bag one day by an old friend of mine in South Ronaldsay, when he said, yes, he said, shrouds and condoms. And you ken what they did with the condom? No, I said. The bairns used them for balloons. This is an Orkney tale. It's called The Book of the Black Arts. Now, there was at one time, probably more than one, Book of the Black Arts circulating in Orkney. Now, where exactly they came from was a bit of a mystery, but it was thought that it was written by the devil in hell. It was a book that had black pages with white writing on it in an antique handwriting, and it was a book of spells. Now, if you died with that book in your possession, the book and you went straight back to its owner and master. And they said that there was a certain horrible torment lined up for the person who died with that book in their possession. There was a terrible place in the lowest pits of hell for the person who possessed that book. Now, there was a man on Sandy, a local crofter, and he became sick. And he grew more and more weak, and it looked like he was going to die. There was nothing they could do about it. There was no medicine that could cure him. Nothing would work. And he was getting thinner and weaker and weaker. And it looked like the very life force of him was ebbing away with every passing minute. Now, this was attributed to an old woman called Rachel, who was a witch. And the two of them had fallen out over something, and she had cursed him. And so he was dying because of that curse. Now, he had a teenage daughter called Chessie, and Chessie knew that her father had fallen out with old Rachel the witch, and she had figured that it was definitely Rachel's curse that was killing her father, and that she had to try to do something about it. Now she plucked up all the courage that her little body could muster, and she went to see old Rachel the witch. She went and opened the door and went in, and the old woman glowered at her. She had received a very frosty welcome, I can tell you. "Please," said the girl, "please, can you help me? My father's dying, and I can't bear to watch him getting weaker and weaker. Please, I know that the two of you don't get on. I know that you've fallen out, but please lift your curse from him. Please let him get better again. I beg you, please." The old woman looked at her with a look of contempt. There was no way she was going to let that man live. "Please," again begged Jessie. "Please, I'll do anything." "Anything?" said old Rachel, and a look of great cunning passed over her face. "Anything at all to save your father?" "Anything," said Jessie. "I promise I will do anything you ask." "Well," said Rachel, "I have here an old book I want to be rid of, and I want you to buy it from me." "Oh, I don't have much money," said Jessie. "That's all right," said the old woman. "It's not expensive. All I want for it is a silver threepenny bit. That's 3 old pennies. It was a small silver coin. All I want is a silver threepenny piece for it," she said. Well, Jessie raked about in her purse, and she found a threepenny bit, and she handed it to old Rachel. And a smile passed over her face, and a look of cunning. Her eyes glowed in their deep-set sockets, and the smile was wreathed around that hideous mouth of hers. And she went and she picked up a great leather-bound book, a great black book, and she thrust it against Jessie's breast. Jessie held the book. "Now be gone," she said. "Get out of my sight. Your father will recover." So she went home carrying this book. She didn't know what it was, of course, but if it came from old Rachel the witch, it was not likely to be anything good. So she didn't take it into the house where people would see it. She hid it in the barn under some straw. And then she went in to see her father. And the news was encouraging. He seemed to have recovered a bit of his strength. So she was so happy. And she watched him get better. Day after day, his strength returned, the colour came back to his cheeks. He was his old self again. And he soon was able to sit up in bed and eat his porridge as good as the rest of them. Oh, she was so happy. And when he was able to get out of bed and walk around, and then start to do some work around the place, oh, her heart soared with joy. But there was still one thing that blighted her happiness. The book. What was it? Well, one day, when there was no one around, she went to the hiding place in the barn, and she took the book, and she took it to her room. She sat down on the bed, and she opened it. There was a horrible, evil smell came off it, like sulphur. And there it was with the jet black pages, and the white writing done in an antique hand, but very fine, well-educated-looking handwriting it was. Now, a lot of the words in it were unfamiliar to Jessie, but she was able to read enough of it to know what kind of book this was. It was a book of spells. But it wasn't about how to win the heart of someone that you loved, or how to bring good luck to anyone. Oh, no. This book was about how to kill animals, how to blight a crop, and how to kill people as well. Put curses on them, wasting diseases, fevers that would burn them up, make them rave with madness before they died. And there was spells of how to raise storms and cast ships away, and also how to agitate the sea to capsize a boat and drown all those in it. That made Jessie shudder when she read it. It was horrible. There was nothing good in that book at all. It was all spiteful and hate. Well, she became fearful. So she grabbed the pages and she tried to tear them out of the book to destroy it. But those pages were as hard as iron. She couldn't even bend one, yet alone tear one out. They were too strong. The magic in it was too strong. So, in desperation, she went over to the fire in the bedroom, and she threw the book onto the fire. And it just lay there, mocking her, the flames dancing around it, but not even a corner of it was singed. She piled on more peats, bits of wood, anything that she could get her hand on to try to burn it, dried tangles, the seaweed, and anything, but not a thing. It wouldn't burn. So after a while, when she saw this was getting nowhere, she took the tongs from the side of the fire and she carefully picked up the book and laid it on the floor. But when she touched it, to her amazement, she discovered it was stone cold. How to be rid of this thing? She got a sack and put it in the bottom of the sack, and she went down to the sea, where the rocks jutted out into the water, and there was deep water there. And she put rocks in the bottom of the sack, and she tied the mouth of it, and she swung it round and round, and she threw it as hard as she could out into the sea, and it landed with a splash and sank immediately. Ah, the relief. So she went home. But there on her bed, lying, was the book, waiting to be used. She was distraught. She went out and got a spade. She dug a deep hole in the ground and she put the book in it, and she filled it in. She could see the earth falling on top of the cover of the book, and then she chomped up and down on top of the turf to make sure that it was well and truly packed down. And then she went back to her room. And there on the bed, lying, was the book, waiting to be used. Now she knew that there was nothing that she could do to be rid of this book. She knew it was evil, and she knew that it had a life of its own. So she plucked up all her courage once more, but she didn't go back to the witch. She knew that there was no chance of her taking it back. But she went to the minister, and she said to the minister, I have something to tell you, something terrible. I was given a book. Well, actually, I bought a book from old Rachel the witch in order to lift a curse on my father. And it's a book with black pages and white writing on it, and it's full of evil spells. And I've tried to destroy it, but I can't." "What?" said the minister. That abomination of a book should be in my parish," he said. "God, what are you, out of your senses?" "No," she said, "I was desperate, and I loved my father so much I tried to save him." Well, the minister calmed down a bit when he heard this. Yes, the girl hadn't bought it out of malice. She had been tricked. But she had bought it willingly. "Well," he says, "I believe that the only thing you can do with these sorts of books is to buy it for a silver coin of a lesser value than the previous owner bought it for." Well, when Jessie heard that, she burst into tears. "What is wrong, my dear?" he said. "I've spent a silver threepenny bit on it," she said. "There is no smaller silver coin than that. I'm doomed." Now, my child," said the minister. "There is always a way, you know." And he went over to a drawer of a cabinet, and he pulled it out, and he rummaged through it, and then, "Ha-ha!" he said triumphantly, taking out a small silver coin. "This," he says, "is an antique coin, no longer legal tender, and it is of a lesser value than the one that you paid for it. So I will give you this coin for the book. Go and bring it to me immediately." She took the coin and she ran home. She took the book and she went back to the manse where the minister lived, and she handed over the book to him. "Now be gone," he said. So she ran away with a light heart for the first time in a while. Now, what the minister did, no one knows other than the minister, and he's long gone. But maybe he prayed over it. Maybe there was some incantations that he knew himself that were for good. But it weakened the power of the book, enough for him to build a mighty bonfire. And he burned the book on the bonfire, and this time the book did burn. And it burned with a thick, acrid, black smoke that rose up and filled the air. It turned the area around that bonfire dark, like night was falling, although the sun was high in the sky at the time. But the book was eventually reduced to ashes. And that, it is said, was the end of the Book of the Black Arts in Sandy. Now, that's an adaptation of a story that was written by William Towery Cutt, or Tory Cutt, as I would say. My grandmother was a Tory for Sandy. Now, he was born and brought up in Sandy, but he emigrated in the 1920s to Canada. And he received a good education there, and he worked in the schools department in Edmonton. And he wrote several books about Orkney folklore. Now, that is a well-known story in Orkney. There's various versions of it going around. But probably the version that he's thinking of, the Sandy one, it was a minister called the Reverend Matthew Armour, who was the Free Kirk minister for Cross and Burness. And that was the parish where my father was born in 1911. Now, the Reverend Matthew Armour came to the parish in 1860, and he was the preacher there. He was the minister, Free Kirk minister, until his death in 1903. And it was attributed to him, the destruction of this book. And it seemed that powerful ministers were the people who these stories attached themselves to, because there was another minister, a Church of Scotland minister, called the Reverend Charles Clouston, and he was the minister in Sandwich from 1832 to 1884, and it was said that he also bought a copy of the Book of the Black Arts from somebody using an ancient coin. And what he did was he buried his one, and he dug a deep hole in the garden of his manse at Flotterstone in Sandwich, and he buried the Book of the Black Arts there with a Bible on top of it to stop it from rising, and then filled in the hole, and that was the end of that. They say that the book is still there, but I would urge anyone not to try to find it, because the consequences will not be pretty. This is a ghost story from the island of Sandy, and it's called The Stolen Winding Sheet. Now, there was an old woman called Baba Skiddawa, and she was a very particular old lady. She liked to have everything nice. And she became ill, and soon she knew that her days were coming to an end, and so she called on a neighbour to come by. Now this neighbour lived at the little croft at Bay in Sandy, and she was called Black Chalk. Now her father had been called Black Chalk, and she was such a rough, coarse, quite horrible woman, really, that everybody just called her Black Chalk, although her name was really Jenny. Well, Black Chalk made a living as a howdy wife, so she delivered babies, but she also washed bodies and dressed them in their shrouds and put them in the coffins, made sure that you went decently out of the world. And so Baba called her to come. Now, she said, you know that I like everything to be done right. Said Black Chalk. Well, I have a winding sheet, she said. Now, a winding sheet, I should explain, is a shroud, a dress to put on a dead body. I have a winding sheet, she said. I bought the material from a stall at the Lammas Fair in Kirkwall many years ago, and I sewed myself this lovely winding sheet. It's in the bottom drawer there. Go and look. I want you to know where everything is for when the time comes. Now, take it out, and maybe I should try it on to see if it fits. But Black Chalk took it out, and she looked at it, and it was lovely. What a lovely piece of material. Black Chalk couldn't stop feeling it. No, there's no need for you to try it on, said Black Chalk. I can see perfectly fine with my own eyes that it's a good fit. Well, you know where to find it, she says, when the time comes. Now, a couple of days later, poor old Baba Skiddawa died, and Black Chalk went up to the house, and she washed the body, and then she went and got the winding sheet, and she took it out, and she couldn't help but to spend a bit of time feeding the cloth again, and looking at it and saying, oh, what a beautiful piece of cloth. She put it on Baba's body, and then Baba was put into a coffin, and there was a leakwak was held. Now, a leakwak was when folks sat with a body, because you never let a body out of your sight in case evil spirits got it. So you would always keep a Bible open in the room and a candle burning all night. And somebody would sit with the body, sometimes more than one, sometimes a crowd of people would come and make a bit of a party of it and drink and play music and such like. But Baba Skiddawa, her leakwak, was held with several people, but Black Chalk sat for 3 nights with her, and always fingering that sheet. Now then, the day of the funeral came, and again people were drinking and talking away. Baba Skiddawa drank like a beast, and always she was fingering this cloth and muttering to herself. She said to Baba Croy, you know, It's a real pity that such a beautiful piece of material as that should be buried. What a waste. Well, Baba was carried down to the kirkyard at Cross, just next to where Baba lived, and she was buried there. Now, folk used to say that Black Chalk was in league with the devil. And you know, maybe she was, because what she did that night was not the sort of thing that anyone would do, any normal person would do. Because in the dead of night, when it was pitch dark, she took a spade, she went up to the graveyard and she dug up Baba Skitherwa's grave. And she broke open the lid of the coffin, and she stole the winding sheet off of Baba's dead body. She replaced her in the coffin naked, put the lid back down, filled it in again, and she went home clutching her prize. And she hid it in the bottom of a chest, a big wooden chest. She hid it in the bottom of that, and then went to her bed. Now, a day or two later, the laird's wife at Elsness had sent a servant, a man called Andrew Moody, to see Lady Fay at down at Stove. And she had to go down there to borrow some barm. Now, barm is working yeast for making home-brewed ale with. If you get this yeast that's still working, you can use that again and again. So, Andrew was sent to get the barm for brewing, and as he was coming back home, it was getting late, and the sky was darkening. But the sky was darkening in an unusual way. It wasn't just night was falling, the whole sky was turning as black as ink. A storm was coming up, a really bad storm. And after a wee while the sky was black, and the thunder started. It roared overhead, and the lightning flashed. Sometimes the forks of lightning struck the land, and sometimes they struck the sea. And Andrew thought that this was the worst storm that he had ever seen in all his born days. Now, by this time it was pitch black, and the lightning was flashing, and the thunder was roaring, and he realized, to his horror, that he had to pass the graveyard at Cross Kirk. Well, that was a place that he wouldn't have liked going past in daytime, but at night. And also it seemed to him that the sky was darkest over the kirkyard. Now, he carried on going, trying to be brave, looking at his feet, not looking at the kirkyard. But when he got there, he saw a sight that made his blood run cold. The hair on his head stood on end with fright, because there, out of every grave in the kirkyard, there soared a tall pillar of light. They were as tall as a ship's mast, and on top of them there were ghosts, the ghosts of the people who were in the grave. Sometimes there was one, sometimes 2, 3, 4 even. And these pillars of light glowed, and they swayed slightly as well, and they were all colours. They were blues and yellows and reds, and they swayed, and the spirits were all talking among themselves, but he couldn't make out a word of it, because the dead have their own tongue. But to him it was like a strange sigh. It made his heart stop. And some of them seemed to be talking to the others, and some of them were pointing, and some of them were laughing and ridiculing, because they always say that when a ghost comes back to earth, it brings their old ways with them. Now, he noticed then what these ghosts were pointing at. There was one ghost on top of the pillar of light, and she was standing there naked as the day she was born. And some were scolding her, and some were laughing at her, and some were sympathizing with her. Well, he recognized the ghost as being that of old Baba Skiddawa. And old Baba was looking backwards and forwards at all the other ghosts, with all their dead clothes fluttering in the breeze behind them. And she seemed quite distressed and sad and ashamed. Well, Andrew stared at her in horror, and she turned her head. She knew that he was there, and she was going to look at him, and Andrew knew that it was a very bad thing to allow a ghost to look you in the eyes. If you look a ghost in the eyes, you will lose your wits. Your senses will go. You'll lose your mind. So he turned around on his heel, and he ran. He ran as fast as he could away from there. And where he ran was the nearest house, and the nearest house was Bay, Black Chalk's house. Well, he went there and he discovered that the door was barred, an unusual thing in those days in Orkney, and he battered with his fists on the door, and he cried to be let in. "Please," he said, "please, please, let me in, let me in. Oh, if ever you hope to have mercy yourself, have mercy on me and let me in. I have seen things this night that I'll never be the better of," he said, banging with his fists on the door. "Oh, in God's name, let me in. Oh, I've seen things that I'll never be right of all my life. I might not speak about life because death's at my heels. Let me in, for God's sake." Well, the door opened, and there was Black Chalk. "Get in, you fool," she said. And he ran through the door, and she slammed it and bolted it again. "What the devil are you out for on a night like this?" she said to him. And when she said the word devil, there was a sudden roar of thunder overhead that was so loud it almost deafened them, and it shook the walls, and the very ground, the floor they stood on, shook. And there was a flash of lightning so bright that it blinded Andrew. When his eyes became accustomed, he could see that there was a fire burning in the middle of the room, and Black Chalk had been preparing things. Now, all the holes in the house had been blocked up. There was 3 awls sticking in the back of the door. Steel, you see, is a strong charm against magic, against evil, against the fairy folk, and against the dead. Now, she had a window, just a small one. There was no glass in it, and it was stuffed up tight, and so was the smoke hole as well above her fire. That was all filled in as well and stuffed in. And she had a little hole above the door in the flagstone of the roof, and it was the cat hole. It was like an ancient cat flap. It's where the cat came in and out, and that was also stuffed up as well with material. And the poor old cat was lying, quivering with fear in the corner of the room. You wouldn't believe," he said. And she said, "Shut up, hold your tongue, go and sit in the corner." Poor Andrew was wanting to tell her about all the horrible things he'd seen, but it seemed that Baba already knew. And she sat down on the floor muttering incantations, and she held a long steel needle in her hand, and she drew a circle around herself with the steel, and then sat down inside the circle. And she sat there holding the needle and muttering away, muttering her spells. Now then Andrew heard it, a noise, like 1,000 scolding voices on the wind, all coming flying down through the air. They went around the house. It sounded almost like the wings of geese beating past the house, like wings fluttering and voices chattering and calling. Some sounded angry and some sounded arrogant, demanding, some sounded fearful, some sounded sorry, but they all sounded terrible in the ears of poor old Andrew, who sat quivering on the floor, trying to hide his head underneath the window. Well, the material started to be pulled from the window, and Andrew saw the face of Baba Skiddawa at the window, wailing and shrieking loudly as she looked inside. And another ghost as well managed to tear out all the blocking from the cat hole, and it put its hand inside, but Black Chalk had put a hook in there, a sickle for cutting crop with, that was stuck above the cat hole. So when the ghost put its hand in and touched the steel, it screamed with pain and drew back. And there was a great consternation went from the other ghosts as well. They all screamed too, and it seemed as though they were going to see what the matter was. And then they became angry. Oh my God, were they angry. And they started to go round and round the house, shrieking and screaming and bellowing, around and around and around the house, and over the top of the house, and even underneath the house the ghosts went. Well, Baba Skiddawa appeared back at the window again, and she raked in her long neck, and her head looked from side to side, and she wailed, "Where's me sheet? Give me back me sheet. I want my winding sheet. Cold, cold it is lying in the ground, mother naked. Give me back my sheet." She managed to get her 2 long, thin arms raked through the window, and her hands flailed in all directions, and she shrieked out of her, and it was so loud, it terrified Andrew. He was cowering on the floor, hands over his head. Well, the long arms were raking inside, searching for what was stolen from her, and her hand touched the top of Andrew Moody's head, the thumb and fingers. And as soon as that happened, he fell unconscious on the floor, and his leg shot out from under him, and it kicked Black Chalk on the elbow, and it knocked that needle out of her hand. Well, Chalk knew the danger she was in. Now she lacked steel. If the ghosts got in, they would tear her to shreds. So she got up, ran over, cleared everything off the top of that kist, opened it up, dug down deep into it, and took out the winding sheet, and she said, "Here you go, take it back, and may the devil take you," she said. Well, the winding sheet jumped from her hand like it was alive, and it shot up through the smoke hole in a blue flame. Well, at that very moment, there was a whack. Something hit Black Chalk on the back and sent her sprawling, face down on the ground. Well, with that, the cock crowed, and she was saved, because when the ghosts heard the cock crowing, they all fled back to their graves as fast as they could fly. Now the next day, when Andrew came to, he discovered that black chalk was lying on the floor. Everything was in a terrible mess, and outside the place looked like it had been through the middle of the eye of a hurricane. And the cows that they had in the byre were lying dead as well. Now, Andrew tried to lift black chalk, but she couldn't get her up. He tried again, but she was stuck solid on the ground. He called the neighbours, and they all came around. 5 men and 3 women pulled and pulled away at black chalk, but nobody could get her lifted from the ground. She was ghost-struck, and nobody could shift her. This was beyond the power of just physical strength. This was a dark magic. Now, they knew they couldn't ask the minister to come and help, because how could they explain this to the minister? No, they called in an old man, old Mancy Pace. Now, he was a man that knew a thing or two. He examined the situation, and he declared that they had to make Forspoken water. He went away and he came back with 7 blue stones, and he boiled them in a pot, muttering incantations over them as they simmered. And then, after a while, when the water had cooled, they poured it over Black Chalk's back, and she was able to get up then. Now, whether she was wiser from this event, who can say? She was an obstinate sort of a person. But the one thing that I do know for certain is that she never interfered with the dead again or tried to steal from them. This is a little tale from the island of Stronsey, here in Orkney. It's called Fated to Drown. There was a man called John Smith who lived on the island of Stronsey, and he was married, and him and his wife had a small croft, and they worked the land there, and they kept a few animals, and also John went to the fishing. Now, he went with 3 of his neighbours. They had a boat between them, and they would go out to the fishing, and they would come back with a good catch of fish, which they would share between them, and that would be very important to dry that fish or salt it and have it for the following winter. Now, he had been at the fishing for several days on the row, and he was tired, and his wife was worried about him. "John," she said, "you shouldn't go to the fishing tomorrow. You're tired. Have a day off. Take some rest." "I can't do that," he said. "Our neighbours are depending on me. I can't let them down." "You're exhausted, man. Stay at home and rest. They'll understand." "No, I couldn't do that," he said. "No, absolutely not. No, I have to go to the fishing tomorrow. There's no way around it." Well, he went to his bed early that night. He was absolutely exhausted, and his wife decided that she would do something about it. If he wouldn't, she would. So she covered up all the windows, and this was a long time ago, so there would have been very little in the way of windows, maybe a skylight or so, or a very, very small window, shuttered, no glass in it. But she covered them all over, and she stuffed up every little hole that let in a little rays of light. Every little hole was blocked up so that the inside of that house was as black as pitch. It was as dark as the tomb. Well, she felt very, very pleased with herself, and she went to bed. Now, the next morning, or when she at least thought it was morning, she very carefully and very quietly got out of bed and left her husband still fast asleep. she got herself dressed, and she went out and started working in the fields. Now, she was congratulating herself at the fact that her husband would have a nice day at home, and he would sleep, and he would rest, and he would be all the more fit for the next day to go to the fishing. Now, as she was working in the field, one of her neighbours came running over, and she was in a terrible state. "Oh, the boat," she says. It's gone down. It's sunk." What do you mean?" "Oh, the boat, it's capsized. All the men are lost, your man too." "But he wasn't on the boat," she said. "Oh my God," she thought, "I've saved his life. The boat's gone over. It's capsized. All the men have drowned. They're all dead. But he's alive. And he's alive because of me." So she turned around and she ran home as fast as she could. She went in through the door and she shouted, "John, John!" But the sight that met her eyes made her blood run cold, because John was lying dead on the floor. You see, back in those days, there was a wooden tub kept by the side of the door called the strang tub, and that's where you kept your urine. Not because you were thinking of going to the doctor and needing a big urine sample, but because it was used for cleaning wool, for washing the oils out of it, and in the process of shrinking homemade cloth. So you kept the urine there for the ammonia that was in it to work the wool. And he had woken up, and not knowing what time it was, he got up into a pitch-black room, and as he was trying to find his way around, he tripped on the floor, and he fell head first into the strang tub, and he drowned in stale urine. Because, you see, he was fated to drown that day, and no matter how hard you try, you can never escape your own fate. This is an Orkney tale which is based on a real event, although it's been folklored up a bit. But it was an event that did happen. But this is the way that they tell it in Orkney. It's the story of the Battle of Summerdale. Now, it's said that the last pitch battle in Orkney took place at Summerdale on the borders between Stennis and Orford in the year 1529. There was actually a later battle at Pabdale, but that's another story. Anyway, what happened in 1529 was more an internal family dispute in the Sinclair family, who were at that time the Earls of Orkney. Now, two illegitimate sons of the old Earl had taken over Kirkwall Castle and kicked out their cousin, who was labelled as being a waster, no good, simple-minded, probably just propaganda by the brothers, but anyway, it doesn't matter. He was supposedly the legitimate heir to the earldom, and now these two had taken over against the wishes of King James V. Now, King James was very aware of the fact that he had only, as King of Scotland, he had only been ruling Orkney for less than 60 years. And so he needed to stamp his authority on the islands. He didn't want people deciding for themselves who was going to be Earl. That was his job, the job of the king. And he didn't like anybody messing around and flouting royal authority. Oh no, didn't like that at all. So it was decided he would send an army north to teach these islanders a lesson. They couldn't flout the rules of the King of Scotland. No, they had to get it through their thick island heads that they were no longer part of Norway. They were not part of an old Viking earldom anymore. They were now part of Scotland, and they had to do what they were told and like it. Now he was raising an army, and another Sinclair, John Sinclair, who was the Earl of Caithness, had volunteered to lead the force, and he raised a great many men, and they had many ships. And the plan was they would sail north from Caithness, sail up through Orkney, through Hawkes Sound, into Scapa Flow, and they would land at Scapa Beach, which is about 1.5 miles from Kirkwall. And then they would march swiftly towards Kirkwall, overthrow the castle, capture it, hang the miscreants, and law and order would be restored. Simple. What could go wrong? Well, there was a date set in June for setting off. Well, what can happen in June? Fog. That's what can happen in June. If you have a hot day here, and then the hot air from the land condenses with the cold air of the North Sea, well, you get fog. And that's what Earl John of Caithness got. He got fog. They were sailing away quite the thing, and suddenly, thick fog, they had no idea where they were. Now, they were in Scapa Flow, so they were heading, as far as they knew, north, and they thought, well, we'll find Scapa Beach. It's a nice sandy beach, and we'll beach the ships there, and we'll go in and we'll knock out the castle. Easy as that. But you try finding a beach in fog. And eventually they did find a beach, a sandy beach, and they went ashore there. Now nobody knows where it was, but my money is on Walkmill Bay in Orford. And they landed there with the idea of heading northwards to Kirkwall, because of course they thought they were at Scapa Bay. And that is where the battle took place, north of Walkmill Bay. So that's where my money is. But anyway, this isn't a history lesson. This is a story. So I'll get down to the good bits. Now, when the Earl came ashore, he was met on the beach by an old woman. Now he could tell a witch when he saw one, and he was looking at a witch now. She was standing there with 2 balls of wool. The one was dyed blue and the other one was dyed red. "Pick a ball of wool, your lordship," she said. And knowing that it's not a good idea to get on the wrong side of a witch, he chose the red one, and she started to carefully unwind the balls of wool, and the red one ran out first. And she said, "Whoever's blood is spilt first will be on the side that loses. Wherever they are from, that will be the losing side." Now Earl John did a very wicked thing. He could see a young boy herding cattle on the hillside, and he sent some of his men off to seize the boy and bring him in front of the Earl. The men went up. The boy stood there in dumb silence, not knowing what to do, and he was led down to the Earl, and he was stood in front of him. And the Earl raised his sword. The boy trembled in fear. There was a flash of a blade, and the boy screamed, and then screamed no more. He fell dead to the ground, and his blood soaked into the soil, and his blood dripped off that blade of the sword in the Earl's hand. "There you go," he said. "An Orkney boy has died. Now that assures victory for us, doesn't it, men?" "You've done a very wicked thing there," said the old woman, "and a very foolish thing. That boy didn't come from Orkney. Him and his mother came across from Caithness last summer. His father had died, and his mother was desperate, and they managed to get work here, herding cattle. You've killed a Caithness boy, not an Orcadian." Well, when the men heard that, they started to mutter among themselves, "Oh my God, what have we done? A Caithness boy has died first. His blood has been shed." Well, the Earl ordered his men to pull themselves together and to follow him, and they marched north. They marched through boggy ground between hills, and when they came to Summerdale, well, the Orcadians had not been idle. Their spies had been watching out for them, and even despite the fog, they knew that they had landed in Orford, and so they were lying in ambush, waiting for them. And when the Earl and his men came up the valley, then the Orcadians attacked. And the one thing that they attacked with first was stones. They threw stones down onto the soldiers below them. Now, I'm not just talking of throwing a pebble. These were big rocks, and they caused terrible injuries and death to many of the men there. Now, a strange thing happened, because the fog had lifted, and a cross was seen in the sky above the battlefield. And the Orcadians took heart, because they said that that cross was the representation of Saint Magnus himself. Saint Magnus, patron saint of the islands, was there, fighting on their side. They said that miraculously stones appeared at the feet of the Orkney men, more missiles for them to throw at the hapless Scots down below. Now then the armies clashed, and a fierce battle was fought, and in it Earl John of Caithness fell dead. Now it was claimed that Saint Magnus himself was seen on the battlefield in armour fighting with the Orcadians against the Scots. Be that as it may, it was claimed, in Orkney at least anyway, that there was no Orcadians killed in that battle, although the Caithness men were routed, and very few of them got away alive, and the ones that did, that seeked pardon, were allowed to return home. Now that, though, claim that there was no Orcadians killed was not strictly true. You see, there was a man who lived in a small hut, a little tumble-down, squalid little shack of a place on the hillside above the battlefield, and he lived there with his elderly mother. He hadn't taken part in the battle, but he'd watched. And then, when it was all over, and the field of battle was strewn with the dead, he went down to help himself. He looked around, and he found things of value, pieces of jewelry, decorative pieces, a nice sword, and also fine clothing. He stripped the dead. He selected the clothes that he liked, the ones that would fit him, and he dressed himself up in the dead men's clothes. He stole from the dead something that you should never do, of course. But he dressed himself up in his fine clothes, and he felt like something. He was like a peacock strutting up and down with pride at this beautiful clothes he was wearing. Oh, he was a man of some importance now. Oh, yes. And he headed off home, back up to the little hut that he lived in with his mother, to show her what a fine son she had. Now the old woman knew that there was a battle going on, and she was not happy about that. Of course, she didn't want trouble, and she was scared that she might be in danger herself. Soldiers might come and kill her. It was, after all, not an unknown thing for the civilians to suffer at the hands of a victorious army. Now she watched from her tiny little door, and she saw a stranger coming up the path towards the house, coming up the side of the hill, a stranger dressed in fine clothing. She didn't know who it was, but she expected danger. She got an old knitted stocking, and she put some rocks in the foot of it, and she hid behind the door, her heart pounding with fear, waiting for this soldier to come in and kill her. So she waited behind the door, and soon the door opened, and in came the stranger, and she slung the sock filled with rocks, and whack, brought it down on top of his head, and killed him instantly. He was lying stretched out on the floor dead, and it was only then that she recognized the face of her own son. You all know the story of the Selkie wife, of course, but there are Selkie men too. We have encountered one in a story here before. Now, this is two little Orkney stories about Selkie men. Now, the first one took place on the island of Sandy. Now, Sandy, that's where my father came from. It's an island that's very flat, and it is made of sand. There is long white beaches there. And when you dig the soil there, there's good earth on the top, but when you dig down a bit, it's just sand underneath. And so there is no fuel there. There's no peat formed there that you can cut and dry for fuel in the winter. What people used was dried tangles, kelp stems that were dried and burnt, and also coo scones, which is cow pats, dried in the sun and then burnt. Now, what some people did was they would take a boat to the neighbouring island of Eddy. Eddy has a huge amount of peat on it, and they would fill up the boat with peat there and bring it back to Sandy, so they could go to Eddy and buy peat. Now, there was a girl called Jessie who lived with her father and her brother. Her mother had died when she was young, and Jessie's father took the boat along with his son, and they went over to Eddy to get a cargo of peats to bring back to Sandy for their own use. Maybe he was selling a bit as well on the side. But he went off this one day, him and his son, and they got to Eddy, and the deal was done, and the peats were ready. But then a gale blew up, a terrible storm, and they weren't able to get home to Sandy. They had to wait in Eddy until the storm passed. Now this left Jessie at home all alone, and she sat by the side of the fire, worrying about her father and her brother and hoping that they were safe. She knew that her father was a very, very skilled boatman, and he wouldn't set off in any bad weather. If he thought there was a danger, he wouldn't put to sea at all. But she sat there, Now, it was a dark night, and suddenly, to her surprise and shock, there was a loud banging at the door. Who could that be? So she went to the door and opened it, and there was a man. He had very dark hair and big brown eyes, and he was soaking wet. It was blowing a gale, but it was also lashing with rain, and this man was absolutely soaking, and he said, "Please let me in. Let me come in and shelter for the night." "Oh, I can't do that," said Jessie. "My father and brother are not at home. I'm here alone. It wouldn't be right for me to let you into the house. And what would the neighbours say as well if they knew that I had a strange man here all night when my father and brother weren't here?" "Oh, for God's sake," he said, "have pity on me. Have mercy. You can't send me out into the night like this. I would die for sure. I have money. I can pay you for a night's lodgings." Well, they didn't have much in the way of money, and that was a tempting offer. To get some money, that would be very, very useful. So Jessie said, "All right, you can come in." And the stranger came into the house, and she closed the door behind him. She went over and she built the fire up a bit more so that it was warmer. And she said, "Come and warm yourself by the fire. You're soaked through." But he said, No, your fire is too hot for me. I'll sit over here." And he sat in the corner of the room, still in his wet clothes. Now, Jessie thought that this was very strange behaviour indeed. What sort of a man would beg to come in out of the cold, and then spurn the fire, and sit in the corner at the draught from the door? Well, what kind of man would do that? But a Selkie man. Oh, yes, he was a Selkie man, and he saw his opportunity. He had long had his eye on Jessie. She was a beautiful young girl. And so, knowing that the father and brother was away, he took his opportunity. And he sat there and he talked. Oh, he talked. And there was such beautiful words in his mouth. Well, I can't say what happened that night. And it is none of my business anyway, and none of yours either. But, needless to say, when her father and brother came home, and 9 months passed, she gave birth to a little boy. Now this boy was half bairn and half Selkie. You see, for half of the month he lived on land with Jessie and his grandfather and his uncle. But for the other half of the month he donned his sealskin, his whiskers and flippers, and he went down to the sea, and there he spent the other half of the month with his father and all his Selkie relations. Now the second story is from the West Mainland, from Yesnaby. Now Yesnaby is an area that has spectacular large cliffs. Now, there was once a young woman who lived at Yesnaby, and one night she had gone out for a little stroll in the evening, and she never came back. Now, her family went and searched for her, but there was no sign of her. And then all the other neighbours got together as well, and they all searched and they hunted high and low, but there was no sign of this young woman at all. And they started to think that there must have been a terrible accident. Maybe she'd fallen over the cliff, but into the sea she must have gone and drowned. Now, not long after that, her brother got a job on board a sailing ship, and he spent the next few years sailing around the world, going from port to port to pick up a cargo and take it to the next destination. Now, there was one day that they were nearing Orkney, and a terrible gale blew up, an awful storm that pitched the ship to and fro. It was tossed on the water, and they thought that the ship was going to founder and sink. But they saw an island. Now, this man was an Orkney man and a sailor, but he didn't know what this island was. He didn't recognize it at all. But it had a sheltered bay, and that was a good thing. So they put into the sheltered bay, and they dropped anchor, and they went ashore with a boat. And they could find nothing on the island but one small house. So they went in and opened the door and walked in. And there was only one occupant of the house, and it was a woman on her own. And the man from Orkney recognized her as being his sister, the young woman that had disappeared all those years before at Yesnaby. He was amazed. "What are you doing here, sister?" he said. "How did you get here?" She wouldn't answer that question, but she asked how all the family was doing and all the people that lived around about Yesnaby. But as she was talking and listening, she was always looking out the window, always looking down towards the shore. And eventually she said to her brother, "You will see a selkie come in through the door, but you must pay no attention to it. Don't make out that you even noticed it." And in no time at all the door opened, and in came a fine big seal. A beautiful, big, sleek, glossy seal. And he stood in the doorway there, and he looked backwards and forwards at all the men. And then he dragged himself into the house, the way that seals do, flopping along the ground. And it went through the room and into another room. And after a short time, a man came through. A very handsome man with dark hair and big brown eyes, and very richly dressed. And he sat by the fire, and he spoke to the men, and especially to his wife's brother. He asked how all the family was as well, and also how the people who lived around Yesnaby, and also around the Bay of Scale, and the neighbouring areas, how they all were, how they were getting on. He seemed to know the area well. "Well," he said to the woman's brother, "I can help you. That was quite a storm you got caught in, and you were lucky to find your way here to shelter. But I can help you to return. Now you have to wait until the moon is waning, and then I will give you a ball. And you must go out in your ship. You will get fine weather at that time, but you must go out in your ship until you reach a certain point. I'll give you all the markings you need to look for, so that you can find your way to the right spot, but it has to be the right spot, and then you can throw the ball over the side of the ship, and you will get a fine wind that will take you home in no time. But mark my words, you have to make sure that you are in the right spot or the magic will not work." Well, days passed and the moon was waning. So he says, "Now it is time that you can go." And sure enough, the weather was actually very good. So they got back on board the ship and they set sail. The wind was with them, and so it was quite an easy voyage. And the man kept his eye on the marks on the island, lining up points so that he knew where they were, and when he thought that they were at the right place, he threw the ball over the side of the ship. But as soon as he did that, The ship had not gone 2 lengths of itself when the wind sprang up, a terrible hurricane blowing right against them, and it turned the ship right around, and it blew it straight back to the island. They found the same sheltered bay and were able to drop anchor there and go ashore. Well, the Selkie man, for obviously that's what he was, said to them, "Well, you didn't do very well that time, did you? Fate was not on your side, was it?" "It appears not," said the young man. "Well, that was your own fault, you know. You didn't listen closely enough to me, and you didn't drop the ball in the sea at the right place. I was nearby the whole time and saw everything that you did, but you threw that ball out too soon, and that's why you've been driven back. But there will be another chance." And sure enough, the wind had gone down, and he was given the ball back again, and they went back on the ship, and they sailed out, and the man was being very careful this time to make sure that they were in the right place, and he dropped the ball into the sea, and the same thing happened. The wind sprang up right against them and drove them straight back to the island. Again, sitting by the fire in the house, the Selkie man said, "You didn't pay proper attention still. You weren't in the right place when you dropped the ball over the side. You have to be more careful next time." So they set off a 3rd time, and they had a good breeze that blew them along, and as the boat got to a certain spot, the man was being very, very, very careful to make sure that the boat was in the right place, and then he dropped the ball over the side, and suddenly there was a wonderful fresh breeze sprang up right behind them, and it blew the ship on, and it blew them right into Orkney to a safe haven. Well, the man went home after that to visit his family and told them all about his sister, who was living on an island that he had never seen before. But he never saw her again, nor that island. And maybe, who knows, she could still be living with her Selkie husband there to this day. Now, this is a wee story for Westry that my mother told me. Now, it's called The Sheep Thieves. But I really should kind of give you the background to this, because my mother was born on the 1st of July, 1922, so she would be 98 this year if she was still with us. And in 1995, her sister died, Mimo. No, Mimo Rendell, or Jemima, as you would know it, but we said Mimo as shortened version. She was living on her own. She was a widow. And when she died, my mother decided to go up and sort out the funeral arrangements. And I went with her to help. And as we were sailing north, we were passing the island of Fairy, North Fairy. And my mother, standing on the side of the boat, said a wee rhyme. I'm going to read it to you here. I have it written in a wee book that I published about stories for Westry. And it's called The Fairy Hooses. Not fairy as in granting wishes and stuff, but fairy as in Sheep Island. Quai caught dogger bot hammer in the ha, le quai ness Holland windy wa, and that's a. Now that's the names of all the hooses on the island of Fairy, from the north to the south. And I'd never heard her coming out with things like this before. And she started to tell stories. Now, she always told me that she didn't know any stories. You know, do you know any folk tales? No, don't know any art things. She had no interest in them, seen no point in them. And there was a great deal of hostility, really, among older folk against folk tales when I first started gathering them and trying to get them back out in front of the public again. And my mother was no exception, really, but she told me this story. But the thing was, it was a true story, she said. She was absolutely determined. This is a true story. Now, long ago, there was a lot of sheep stealing going on all through the islands. And a lot of the time they liked to pin it on the travelling folk. But, of course, they were a convenient excuse. I dare say that there was a few who ended up in their pot as well, but they were good scapegoats. And sheep would be going missing, and you could easily blame it on somebody travelling through the area. Well, on this occasion there was a group of sheep thieves, 3 of them, that were working out of Pirrawell, which is the main village in the island of Westray. And in the middle of the village there is Ladykirk, a church dedicated to St. Mary. And that's where my ancestors are buried. My grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, etc., etc. Anyway, the graveyard was a good place to operate in if you were a sheep thief, because who would be going in the graveyard at night? There was a great deal of superstition about ghosts, and people were too scared to go anywhere near a graveyard in case there was a ghost lurking around. Now, there was a group of young men, teenagers, just boys really, and they were all kind of daring each other. Would you go into the graveyard at the dark of night, around midnight? No, they wouldn't do that. I bet you wouldn't. Well, no, I wouldn't, So there was bets going on, but, nobody would take up the offer. Everybody was scared to go in there. But there was one young man who came up to join them. And he had been crippled since he was a child, so he went around on a couple of sticks, but he had a great deal of trouble moving around. So he came up anyway, and he says to them, "Well, boys, what's the news tonight?" "Oh, we were just speaking about ghosts." "Ghosts? Oh, why, what about ghosts?" "Well, I bet you wouldn't go into the graveyard at midnight, would you?" "Yes, I would," he said. He, of course, had no intention of doing it, but he didn't want to seem to be a coward in front of all these guys. "Oh, yes, I would, but unfortunately I couldn't because, of course, I'm on sticks here, I can't walk properly, and it's very uneven ground, so no, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't be able to make it there." "We'll carry you," they said. "Ah, yeah, we'll carry you into the graveyard and leave you there." Well, the young lad didn't like the idea that much at all, and of course he was scared of ghosts, but he couldn't let himself be seen to be scared. So in the end he had to go along with it. So the 2 of them picked him up and carried him towards the gate of the kirkyard. Now meanwhile, one of the sheep thieves was in the kirkyard, hiding behind a gravestone, because he was waiting for his pals to come back. They would take them down to the kirkyard there, and then they would, gut them and get them all sort of sorted out. But anyway, he was waiting there, and he heard the sound of the gate opening, and the sound of 2 people coming in carrying something, a heavy weight between them. And he said from behind this gravestone, "Is he fat, boys? Is he fat?" Well, the 2 young men, when they heard that, they dropped the poor cripple boy and they legged it. They ran out as fast as they could. But they said no matter how fast they ran, the cripple boy was home before them. Now, my mother explained to me who this boy was, that he was the grandfather of so-and-so and such like. The whole genealogy was there, and it made it legitimate to tell that story because it wasn't a folk tale. But I have found the same story in another part of Orkney, and in the Western Isles, and in the Scottish Highlands. so it's a story that has done the rounds. But she always maintained, no, that was a true story. I'll leave it up to you to decide. This is a story from Orkney Saga, the Icelandic saga about the Earls of Orkney. Now, after Earl Hakon had killed his cousin Magnus, he ruled Orkney on his own until his dying days, and then he left the earldom to his 2 sons. Now, the one son was to his wife, and it was a young man named Paul, who was known as Paul the Silent. But with his mistress, a woman called Helga Modden's daughter from Caithness, whose father was a great chieftain over there, he had a son called Harold, and he was known as Harold Smooth-Tongue. I'll leave you to figure that one out for yourselves. Now, the 2 of them ruled together, but they did not get on. Now, Harold usually lived over in Caithness, and he held lands there from the King of Scotland, and seems his grandfather was a chieftain there as well. It made sense that he would live there and rule from there. But he had to go to Orkney and rule as well, because there was always the fear of losing power. So he set off with an entourage with him, which included his mother Helga and her sister Frakok, who was quite a domineering woman. Well, they both were, but Frakok was a powerful leader in her own right. Now, it soon became obvious that Helga and Frakok had a great deal to do with the running of the earldom, and that Harold did what they told him to. Now, they decided to split the islands between them, as they had been split between Hakon and Magnus. And the one would have the West Mainland and Scotland, so that would have been Harold, and then Paul would have the East Mainland and the North Isles and Shetland. Now, this situation didn't work terribly well, because the men couldn't get on. And also, there was a friend and kin by marriage who had the name of Sigurd Fakedeacon, and he had travelled to Orkney with them as part of Harold's entourage, and him and Harold had a hatred against a man known as Thorkel Fosterer, not to be confused with the foster father of Thorfinn the Mighty, who was a couple of generations before these men. But this man was a close kinsman to St. Magnus, and he was very, very popular in the islands, a much respected man. But he had suffered immensely at the hands of Hakon, who persecuted those near relations of Magnus. And so Hakon and Sigurd Fakedeacon set off with an army of men and attacked Thorkel and killed him. Well, when news of this reached Paul, he was furious, and he raised an army to go and attack his half-brother Harold. Well, the chieftains and the local farmers were worried. There's nothing worse than a civil war. That tears the country apart. It tears families apart. It brings no good to anybody. Well, the farmers were worried about this, so the people rose up, and many friends went back and forth between the 2 half-brothers, and said that the people of Orkney had decreed that those most closely involved with the murder of Thorkel the Fosterer had to be exiled from Orkney, and that a tribute had to be paid to his family as well, in way of compensation. And so it was agreed, and Sigurd the fake deacon was sent out of Orkney, and Harald had to pay compensation to the family of Thorkel. Well, the chieftains and the farmers also made the two brothers swear to try to get on together on friendly terms, and the best way of starting that, they said, was to share feasts, hold a feast for each other, and it should start that Yule, and it was Harald's turn first to entertain his brother Paul in style. This would be done at his farm in Orford, the current day Boo in Orford. Now, a preparation was made for a great feast, and Paul arrived there, and everything was going off okay between the two. I mean, they weren't exactly best buddies, but they tolerated each other. Now, one morning, Harald had just got out of bed, and he went through to a small room where his mother Helga and her sister Frakok were working. And they were working on a garment, and oh, what a garment it was! It was a shirt made of white linen that was as white as snow, and it was beautifully embroidered with gold thread. Well, Harald, when he saw that, he said, "Whose is this treasure?" "Oh, it's a shirt that we're making for your brother Paul," said his mother. "Why take so much trouble over his clothes?" said Harald. "You're not so particular over mine." "Oh, don't be envious of your brother's clothes," said his mother. "Well," he said, and he went to grab it. "No," said his mother, "you have no reason to be jealous of your brother just because he's got some fine clothes." But Harald wasn't listening. He was just out of bed, and he was wearing a light, thin shirt and a little pair of shorts, leggings, little knee breeches, really, but baggy. And over all of that, he'd thrown a mantle. Well, he cast off his mantle, and he grabbed the shirt, and the women started to scream and cry, and they pulled their bonnets off, and they tore their hair, and they said, "No, no, don't put that on. Whatever you do, do not put that shirt on." And Harald ignored them. "No," they said, "your life is in danger. Don't put that shirt on." But he did. He put the shirt on, and no sooner had that shirt touched his back than he started to shake and tremble, and his flesh quaked and burned, and he was consumed with great agonies. Well, he had to go to his bed, but his condition got worse, and he died soon after. Now, when Paul heard about this, he knew that that shirt that had been made for him, had been poisoned, and probably woven with spells cast into it as well. Spells, deep black witchcraft that would kill him. But fate chose that he wouldn't put it on. And so he had Helga and Frakok banished from Orkney. They went over to Caithness, and then they went down to Sutherland, where Frakok held an estate. And she raised many important children there, including Margaret, the daughter of Earl Harkin, who would come into the Orkney saga later. But after that, Paul ruled Orkney all alone, until he had a request from a cousin, Rogvald Kalli Kolson, over in Norway. But that is another story. This is a story from Orkney saga, and it's about how Earl Rogvald Kalli Kolson got to be Earl. Now, St. Magnus, when he died, he had no heirs to his half of the earldom. He had no family. But his sister had been married to a Norwegian nobleman called Cole Callison, and they had a son called Kalli Kolson. Now, later, he would claim his half of the earldom, and he would take the name of Rogvald from a previous Earl of Orkney, Rogvald Bruseson, who was considered to be the most accomplished of all the Earls of Orkney. Now, he sent messengers to Orkney to ask for his share of the earldom, but Paul the Silent said no. If he wanted a share of the island, he had to come himself and fight him for it. And an army was raised, and a fleet of ships was raised, and in 1135 they set off for Orkney. Now Rogvald travelled to Shetland, while friends and kinsmen down in Scotland sailed up to Orkney, and the idea was that the two fleets would meet. But Paul intercepted the fleet from Scotland and defeated it, and then had time to head to Shetland and capture all of Rogvald's ships while his men were ashore sleeping. Well, this didn't end very well for Rogvald, who returned to Norway as a bit of a laughingstock, but he'd made friends in Shetland, and his father said that was a very useful and very powerful thing. Now, the next year he set off again, and they realized that they had to come up with a fairly cunning strategy in order to capture Orkney, because after that first fleet had turned up, and knowing that there would be another attempt, Earl Paul had had bonfires built on all the hills and all the high ground around Orkney. They still bear the name to this day, Ward Hill. The ward was the warning bonfire, and once one of those beacons was lit, then you would see it from another island, and you would light that beacon, and a whole chain of fire would spring up, and that would call all the men to arms. Now, the most northerly of these beacons was on Fair Isle. Fair Isle is part of Shetland, but it lies right between Orkney and Shetland, about halfway. Now, Rogvald's men landed in Shetland, and they had sworn as well, again, Cole, Rogvald's father, had said that if he wanted to claim his half of Orkney, he should call on his uncle, the Holy Saint Magnus, to be part of this strategy. And he swore that he would build a fine stone minster in tribute and honour of his uncle, Magnus. It would be a fine cathedral built in Kirkwall. Well, the trouble was they were in Shetland, but how to get to Orkney without everyone knowing because of those beacons? Now, the Fair Isle beacon was the key one. That would be the first that would be lit as they sailed down from Shetland. And so they had to do something to put it out of action. Now, Coll was a fairly cunning man, a very intelligent man, and he had an old friend with him, Uni, and Uni had a reputation as being as sly as a fox. And they said, well, we need to come up with some plan in order to put that beacon out of action. And so Coll had an idea. Not something to get past the beacon, but something to stir up trouble and dissension among the chieftains in Orkney. So he set off with a group of ships, and when they got about halfway towards Fair Isle, near enough that people on Fair Isle could see the ships, what they did was they lowered the masts so that they were at half-mast, and then they rowed against the wind to try to keep the ship fairly stable, fairly stationary, so that it didn't go too near to Fair Isle. And then, very slowly, they raised the masts, so that on Fair Isle you would think that the ships were coming closer and closer, when in fact they weren't moving really at all. Now, when Dagfinn, the man who was in charge of the beacon, saw this, he fired his beacon, and then set off to join Earl Paul in Orkney. Well, when Thorstein in North Ronaldsay saw the Fair Isle beacon lit, he lit his beacon as well, and then all the beacons spluttered into flame right across Orkney, and there was a great gathering of men. Now, when they got there, and waited, and nothing happened, then incrimination starts. They started blaming each other, and Dagfinn from Fair Isle blamed Thorstein Ragnarsson from North Ronaldsay, saying that he had lit his beacon too early. "How can you say that?" said Thorstein. "I lit my beacon because you lit your beacon first." And Dagfinn denied this. And he said, "I saw the beacon lit, and that's why I lit it." And a great argument struck out between the two. And there Thorstein dealt Dagfinn his death blow. And then the two sides started to argue, and it looked like factions was going to start up, and they would start to fight. But some of the wiser chieftains there stopped them, and said, "No, this is exactly what Rogvald wants. He wants us to fight between ourselves and not fight him." And so a new beacon keeper was appointed on Fair Isle, a man called Eric. And Eric sat there by the side of the beacon, watching, always watching to the north to see if there was any ships coming, a battle fleet, and then he would light the fire. Now, Coll returned back to Shetland and said to Uni, "Now it's your turn. See what you can do." And so Uni selected 3 young men from Shetland, and they set off in a small boat, and they landed on Fair Isle. And Uni claimed that he was a Norwegian who was married in Shetland and had 3 sons, and these were the 3 men that was with him, and that they were fishermen, and they had been out fishing when they were attacked and captured by Rogvald and his men in their ships. And they had taken from them anything that they had, and then let them go again. And Uni swore that he was no friend of Rogvald's. He would see that thief on the end of a rope, stealing from a fisherman. Well, the 3 young men said that they would carry on fishing, and the old man said that he would stay there on Fair Isle. And he was a charming man, and very funny, very good company. And he made friends with everyone on the island. Everybody liked Uni. And Uni used to like to spend time sitting chatting to Eric by the side of that beacon. "Why do you sit here the whole time, Eric?" said Uni. "I'm an old man, and I have nothing to do I'm sure you've got better things to do with your time than sit here. Why don't you let me sit at the beacon, and I'll watch for a while? Well, Eric said that would be wonderful. He would love it if he would sit and watch while he went and did other things. And Uni said, oh, yes, he would be happy to sit there and to watch, keep an eye out to the north in case that horrible wretch Rogvald turned up again with his men, those pirates, as he called them. And so Eric, delighted, went off home, and Uni sat by the side of the beacon. It was like putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. And he went off and got buckets and buckets of water when he was alone and there was nobody there. He went backwards and forwards with bucket upon bucket upon bucket of water, and he soaked that beacon. He soaked every timber, every stick of that beacon was soaking wet. Well, the next thing that they knew was there was a battle fleet of Rogvald heading into sight. Quick, light the beacon, they shouted, and Eric ran up to the beacon, and he expected to find Uni there. He was going to shout to him to light the beacon, but there was no sign of the old man. He had flown. Well, they then turned and tried to light the beacon, but it wouldn't light. That beacon was absolutely soaking wet. There was no way that they could light that fire. And so Rogvald's battle fleet sailed right past them and straight down to the island of Westray. Now, Paul was on Rousey at the time, and he was staying with his friend Sigurd of Westness, and not only a friend, but a kinsman through marriage. Now, there was no way that his ships could sail to Westray because the tide was against them. Rogvald had selected his timing very well, and there was no way that the ships could get up there, so they had to call a truce between each other and decide to meet to discuss terms. But that never happened, because a young chieftain called Sven Asleverson, who Paul had outlawed the year before, he turned up unexpectedly and kidnapped Earl Paul, who was brought down to his half-sister Margaret Hakon's daughter, who had married Earl Modden of Athol. And there he was kept. But people said that his sister had him blinded and cast into a dungeon, where later he was murdered. Some said that Sven did the murdering himself. This is a folk tale from the island of Sandy, where my father came from. And it's called the Nucklavee. Now, there was a man called Tammy who lived on the island of Sandy, and he was out late one night. Maybe visiting friends, I don't know. But he was out late, and he was walking home. Now, the route that he took ran by the side of the seashore. And on the other side, there was a freshwater loch, a lake. And as he was walking along the road, he saw that there was something, or someone, down on the shore. A large black shape moving around. He had no idea what it could be, so he carried on walking. And as he got closer, he started to feel a really uncomfortable feeling. Something uncanny was moving down there, something supernatural, something not nice. Well, when he got a bit nearer, he could see now the shape of the thing heading towards him, and his blood ran cold, because it was nothing less than the Nucklavee. Now, the Nucklavee is, of all the supernatural creatures that roam the shores or roam the hills of Orkney, that is the most fearful. That is the most hideous and the most malevolent evil. And it was walking towards Tammy. Now, Tammy was a brave, rather foolhardy young man. And he'd always heard that it was better to face evil, supernatural creatures like this, rather than run away from them. But when he got nearer and he could see the Nucklavee, oh, it was like a thin sheet of ice underneath his scalp when he saw it. The fear, his blood ran cold. He started to shake. Sweat poured out from every pore. Because the creature seemed to be like a man on a horse. The horse was hideous to look at. A great beast of a thing that had flaps of flesh around its legs like flippers. And in the middle of its head, there was one eye, and it was as red as coals. Hideous-looking thing with a wide mouth. And on top of it, riding it, or it seemed to Tammy, actually growing out of the back of this creature, there sat the rider. It was like a man, but a grotesque parody of a man. Its head was 10 times bigger than a normal man's. They said it was the size of a Clewa Simmons, a ball of straw rope, which is about 3 foot in diameter. And the head was so big and ungainly that the neck could barely support it, and it lolled from side to side. Its arms were so long that they almost touched the ground. But the thing that was so hideous about this monster, or this pair of monsters, was the fact that there was no hair on their bodies at all. And there was a very good reason for that. It was because there was no skin on their bodies. It was just raw, red flesh. And every time they moved, he could see the sinews, white sinews, twisting, and they were as thick as a horse's tether. But the worst thing of all was the yellow veins that stood out against the red flesh. And in those veins, black blood was coursing. It was hideous to look at. Now it moved up closer towards Tammy. And Tammy remembered then that there was one thing that the Nucklavee could not stand, and that was fresh water. It lived in the sea, and in the summertime it was kept in check by the mother of the sea, who kept it locked up. But in the winter, when Terran ruled the sea, then it could come ashore. But the only thing that saved it from destroying all of Orkney was the fact that it rains a lot in the winter, and it couldn't bear the touch of fresh water. So it stayed on the shore. But as it moved up closer, the Tammy backed towards the freshwater loch, knowing that this would be some kind of protection. The monster came up close to it, so that the lower head, the head of the horse-like creature, was now very close to him. He could feel the hot breath which came from its mouth like steam from a kettle. And he backed up just as the rider was swinging an arm to grab him. Well, he backed up, he stumbled into the loch, and some of the fresh water got splashed on the forelegs of the horse, and it roared out of it in pain. The sound of it was like the roar of the sea. Well, it backed up, and Tammy then remembered that the Nucklavee, like many of these supernatural creatures, could not cross running fresh water, and that there was a small burn that trickled from the loch down the seashore to the sea. So he turned and he fled towards that as fast as he could. Now the horse was in pain from being burnt with the fresh water, which burns the Nucklavee just like acid. But the rider had got it under control and was furious. He had missed this creature because the horse had shied away as he swooped his hand. So they gave chase. Now Tammy knew that he couldn't outrun a Nucklavee, but if he could get over that running water before the creature reached him, then he was safe. He ran for all his might. He ran like his life depended on it, because it did. The monster came behind it with a roar, and again the monstrous rider reached his arm back to swipe. But just at that moment, as the great hand was swiping towards Tammy, he leapt as fast and as hard as he could over that burn. He could feel the air from the swipe of the monster's hand, and it caught the bonnet off his head, and he landed safely on the other side of the burn, and he fell there into a swoon. And behind him the Nucklavee roared with rage, clutching just Tammy's bonnet in its horrible hand. Now, this is a story from North Ronaldsay, the most northerly island in the Orkney Islands, and it was recorded in the 60s from Sidney Scott of Antibreck. I know his sons Sinclair and Ian very well, and so it's nice to be able to pay a nod in the direction of the ancestors as well, for the old men that told stories a long time ago, and the ones that were recording them as well. They've saved stories. It's wonderful. It's called The Dead Wife Among the Fairies. Now, there was a young couple who lived in North Ronaldsay, and they fell in love. They walked out together. They'd known each other since they were bairns, and they were devoted to each other. But then the two of them married, and they were so happy. Everything was going great for them. But then, all of a sudden, the woman took ill, and she died. Well, the man was absolutely heartbroken, devastated. It just consumed every waking moment thinking about his wife. But he thought that there was something strange going on. He thought that the way that she died, and so suddenly, was something uncanny about it. So he went to see a spaewife. A spaewife is a kind of a witch, someone who has a lot of knowledge in magic. And so he spoke to the spaewife, and he asked her what she thought about it. Well, she said, I think the fairies have taken her. I think that she is in a mound at the Brae of Ramray. So, there is a way that you can see your wife again. And if you mark my words well, then you will see her. What must I do? How can I get her home for good? You can't. You cannot get her home for good, but this is the best that I can offer you. So she told him that he had to get an oaken stick, and a Bible, and a black cat. And then he had to wait until the night of the full moon, and when the moon was full, he had to go up to the Brae of Ramray, and there was a mound. And he would see in the bottom of the mound there was a hole like a little heathery cave. And he had to go there, and he had to call his wife by name. And then he had to throw in the black cat, and he had to read verses from a psalm from his Bible until he saw his wife rising out from the depth of the darkness and coming out towards the entrance. But then the fairy folk would come and try to stop her. But when she spoke for the first time, then he could leap in among them and beat them savagely with the oak staff. And only that way would he be able to then spend the night with his wife, talking to her. So he went up on the night of the full moon to the Brae of Ramray, to the mound, and there in the bottom of the mound there was a hole like a cave. And he called his wife by name several times, and he threw the black cat in, and he read verses from the Psalms from his Bible, and his wife appeared in front of him, coming out from the darkness from deep down within the mound. And then the fairy folk came up and grabbed her and tried to pull her back in, and she spoke. And he leapt down next to her, and he beat the fairies with his staff until he drove them all squealing and screaming back to the depths of their mound. And then he could spend the night talking to his wife. But as soon as the dawn raised, she disappeared back down that dark tunnel, back into the mound, and was not seen again for another month until the moon was full, and he could go back with a black cat, a staff, and a Bible. And he did that for as long as he lived. Every night of the full moon, he got to sit and talk, and maybe reminisce about the things that they had done in their childhood, the life that they had had together, and the life that they would have had together if she hadn't been carried away by the fairies. Now that mound doesn't exist anymore, and the reason it doesn't exist is because they built the new lighthouse on top of that very spot. It's not a new lighthouse, it's about 160 years old, but it's new compared to the other lighthouse that stands a bit further down the coast from there. But that is the story, anyway, of the dead wife among the fairies. This is a Selkie story with a difference. It comes from the island of Grimsey. It's called The Bride of Ramray. Now there was a young man on Grimsey called Jamie, and there was such a buzz of excitement on the island because he was marrying Kitty Yorston, and Kitty was a bonny lass, and her father was very rich, had a lot of land and a lot of goods. So Jamie was busily preparing away for the wedding, but there was one thing that they had to ensure, something, a precaution that they must take in order to keep Kitty safe. You see, Selkie men could steal a bride on the day of the wedding. And if they could steal a bride away before sunrise on the night that she married, then you would never see her again. And in her place they would leave a replica, a thing that they called a sea wife, who seemed to be a woman as well, but very quiet, very strange, and very sour-tempered. Now, the way that you had to prevent this from happening was you had to keep a very close watch on the house that night. Now, the wedding was all prepared, and the couple walked to the kirk, and they were married there. The minister kissed the bride and led the dancing, as was the tradition, and then they walked back the wedding walk all the way back to Ramray. Ach, it was a happy place. They'd swept out the barn, and all sorts of lovely food was prepared, and a big feast was just spread out for everybody. The whole island was there, and a lot of friends as well. Well, this was all going fine, and that night the festivities were going on, and the whole time that was happening, 2 men, friends of Jamie's, were guarding the outside of the house to make sure that the Selkies didn't come up. You see, Selkie men can transform themselves into human form as well. So can the Selkie women, of course. But this was the danger tonight, was from a Selkie man. So they were going round and round the house, keeping watch, making sure that nobody came near. Now inside, Jamie had his part to play as well, because he had to sit with his right arm around his bride, and his left hand had to rest over her heart, and every now and again he had to give her a little kiss as well. And this was a way of reducing the Selkie folk's magic spell. Now the night was going on, and the 2 men were still patrolling round and round the house, when at the head of the close they saw a great big seal. They ran over to it and they grabbed it. They tied it up, tied its front flippers to its body, and they dragged it around to the end of the house, where there was a great big nail sticking in the gable end of the house. And they tied a rope around its back flippers, and they hoisted it up, hanging it head down from that big nail in the gable end of the house. And then they took a great gully, and they slit the seal's throat. Well, that was that done, they thought. He won't be bothering us any more. And they went inside to tell everybody the good news. They were safe from Selkies now. Oh, that was such a relief. But the sun hadn't risen yet. And Jamie and Kitty, well, they got careless. Kitty started wandering around, talking to her friends all through the house and outside as well, telling her young female friends that, if they were on the lookout for a husband, then this might not be a bad night to try to land one, because weddings always made people's thoughts turn to love. Now, Jamie was going around being slapped on the back by his friends and congratulated again, being called a lucky dog. And, of course, there was always an ale cog at his head, too. He was enjoying himself now. But then, before sunrise, they had a commotion outside, and a cry, and they ran out, and Kitty was gone. And in her place was a sea wife, a strange thing of little words and sour temper. They ran around to the end of the house, and the big nail was still there, but there was no seal suspended from it. He was gone, and he'd taken Kitty with him. Well, Jamie's mother said that he was always a useless thing, could never do anything right. She attributed the fact to the circumstances of his birth. You see, a child's first drink has to be off silver. It's usually a wee bit of warm water and sugar and whiskey, like a wee toddy, to revive you coming into the world, I think you'd probably need it, wouldn't you? But it had to be off silver, unless you would have absolutely no luck in life. And if you didn't have a silver spoon or couldn't borrow one, then a silver coin in a horn spoon would do. But they didn't have even that. So it was just a wooden spoon got shoved in his mouth, and he never had much luck or much wit after that. Well, despite his loss, Jamie decided that the sea wife was probably better than nothing. Old man Yorston went away, and that was the end of that. The dowry went with him, 30 ells of great cloth, and there was 2 pigs that were running wild in the Hoy Hills, and he was also to get several grey sheep, and a young cow as well, and if they had sons, he would have inherited all of old Yorston's land. But that wasn't going to happen now. But Jamie made the most of it, and he raised a large family with his sea wife. But as for Kitty, the Selkies got her. It's late now, nearly midnight on the 22nd of December, and I thought I would share a couple of stories with you for Christmas. I'm sitting here in the library in my home in Stromness. Normally I record upstairs in an attic bedroom, but tonight I'm down here in the library, surrounded by books and weird ethnographic and maritime things. Now, a lot of people won't be able to get home this Christmas, and so I thought I would tell you an Orkney story about something that happened to a man a long time ago who wanted to be home for Christmas. Now, the good man of Farracklet in Rousey worked the farm there, but he also had a ship, and he would sail to Norway, and there he would trade goods. He would bring over grain with him, which he would be able to sell, and he would buy things made of wood and take it back to Orkney and sell it here. Now, one year, he decided to try to fit in a 3rd trip just before winter. And it wasn't a very wise plan at all, because as he got his ship loaded up with a cargo, and he set off with his small band of men that worked with him, his tiny little crew, the wind started to rise after they left Norway. And soon it had built up into a huge storm. A terrible gale battered the ship. The sea was mountainous and cruel. And after a while, struggling away with this ship, they could see in front of them, although it was dark, there was white strips on the horizon. And that was not a welcome sight, because that could only mean one thing, that there was rocks there. That was the sea churning and battering against the rocks. And they were heading straight towards it, and there was nothing they could do. They couldn't turn the ship around. They couldn't maneuver it at all. They were at the mercy of the wind, and the wind knew no mercy. So they were driven on until they struck the rocks, and the ship was broken to pieces. The crew were cast into the water, but luckily they all managed to struggle ashore. But the ship was lost, and the cargo was lost too. Now the men were taken in by some of the local people. The good man of Farracklet had enough money on him to be able to pay something towards these people, just to put money and a bit of food on the table for the men that were his crew, the men that they had rescued and taken in. Now he himself stayed with an old woman, and this old woman stayed away from everybody else, kind of on the outskirts of society, but she was kind. She was good to him. She looked after him well. She fed him well. and she was always cheerful. But the good man of Farcliffe wasn't cheerful. Far from it. He was a long way from home. He was marooned on Shetland, and the storms carried on raging. There was no letter, and there was no chance of getting another boat to take them down to Orkney. So he was stranded there. And of course, there was no way of getting a message to his wife to tell her that he was still alive. And as the days wore on, it neared to Christmas. And at Christmas Eve, he was sitting by the side of the old woman's fire, and he was looking downcast and depressed, staring into the flames. And the old woman said to him, "What's wrong with you tonight, boy?" "Well," he said, "I'm not feeling just too happy." "Why, what's wrong with you?" "Tell me," she said. "Maybe I can help." "Ah, there's nothing you can do," he said. "Not a thing. You see, tomorrow it's Yule Day, Christmas Day, and I'm going to be away from my family. For the first time in my married life, I will not be at home with my wife and children. In fact, she doesn't even know if I'm still alive or not. And so I may well look sad." Said the old woman. "Yeah, that is bad right enough. Ah, I bet you would love to be home in the arms of your wife tomorrow morning." "Oh, that I would," he said. "I would give anything for that." "You'd give anything for that? I bet you would," said the old woman. "In fact, I bet that you would give the best cow that you have in your byre. I bet you would give that as a price that you would be happy to pay if you could wake up in your own bed tomorrow morning." "Oh, that I would," he said. "Oh, without the blink of an eye, I wouldn't take any time to agree to that." Said the old woman. "Well, here's a glass of gin. Drink that, go to bed, and if you tell me your dreams in the morning, I'll give you a shilling for Hansel." So the man drank the gin, and he went off to his bed, and he fell into a deep sleep. Now, back on Rousey, his wife was lying in bed, and she'd fallen asleep too, but it had taken her a long time. She was thinking about her husband, and where he could be, and was he still alive, or was she now a widow, which seemed quite likely. It was the first time they'd been apart since they were married at Christmas time, and she was worried sick about him. But eventually she fell asleep. Now, in the middle of the night, she woke, and she could swear that she could feel someone in bed next to her. And as she woke up a bit more, she could hear the sound of soft snoring. A man was lying in bed next to her. Well, she got up and she battered him. She said, "Get out of my bed! How dare you, you vile beast! How dare you come into an honest woman's bed like this?" And she battered on him with her fists. The man opened his eyes, and to his amazement he recognized the voice of the woman who was shouting at him, and he said, "Maggie? Is that you? Is that you, Maggie?" "Yes, I'm Maggie," she said, as she gently squeezed him by the throat. And he said, "Don't you recognize me, your own man?"
Well, she stopped throttling him and looked at him. Sure enough, there in bed alongside her was her husband. Well, mercy, she says, you could have woken me up and told me that you were home. I didn't know I was home, he said. And he explained to her about how they'd been shipwrecked on Shetland and how the old woman had said that, I bet you wished you could be back home tomorrow morning. And he said, he would give anything for that. And then a thought entered his mind. And he said, well, you might not be so happy when you see the price that this cost us. And they went out to the buyer, and sure enough, their best cool was gone. You see, the old woman, she wasn't a witch. Oh no, she was a lot more powerful than a witch. She was a Finwife, one of the women folk of the Finfolk. And it was said that when they grew old, that they went to live on land and they acted as witches, but they had so much more power. Sorcery was in their fingertips and they could do whatever they wished. Now, that was the agreement that they had come to, and that was the price that was paid. His best cow, the best milker he had, was gone. And, there was another man that lived on Rousey called James Flett, and he went to Shetland the following year, and he swore that he saw that cow chewing the cud outside that old woman's house. You see, he had known that cow well, and there was no mistaking her. And there she was, standing contentedly alongside that old woman's house up in Shetland. Eynhallow, the Finfolk's Lament. I can still hear the cries when night comes softly with a bag full of dreams. Screams tear through my mind, lamentations the like of which I have never had to endure. Oh, how we wept that day, we children too small to understand. How the men cursed and swore vengeance, spitting hate and spite from their twisted lips. But it was to no avail. Everything was lost in a circle of salt. The air drinkers came, like thieves without compassion, spurred on by revenge for another theft, that of a wife, newly wed, who danced on the shore. He shouldn't have done it, we knew that, but his desire consumed his reason, and he pulled her into his boat. No good would come of it, the elders said, but his mind was closed to their words. She sang a song that pierced the enchantment, sending words of wisdom to her lost husband. He learned the secret from a wise woman, to see that which was concealed. He saw our island, hidden from mortal gaze, and knew the means by which he could win it. A dark curse lay on that bright day of sunshine and lark song, when our island lost its shield, as we bairn sat singing to the Selkies, our sea-tossed brethren. The sea-steed was seen on the whale road, bringing a fatal kiss to our shores. Mist would not blind those eyes and hide our isle from the power of the witch's charm. The elders gathered, raising their arms outstretched, muttering spells to cloak us. Whales were conjured from sea foam, huge shapes that would terrify the unwary. But he was immune to our tricks, and a handful of salt broke the dream. The song of the mermaid, sweet and intoxicating, drifted on the air and wrapped around the air-drinkers' sons, filling their heads with honey and longing. But the old man remembered his young bride and his cold bed, and he cast crosses to stop their tongues. Now his feet had found our shore, and a last phantom was created to turn his course. A monster that drank fire like he drank air stood before him, and a slow growl made the ground tremble. But a gift of salt dissolved it into nothingness. Now he stood proud, sword in hand, cursing the invader. Go now while ye still can, or suffer my blade. The air-drinker, unflinching, met his gaze. You stole my wife, so I will take your island as her dowry. Another cross flew, filling the Finn man with fear, causing him to flee, tearing his flesh at the pain of its touch. Then the others came with the white curse, the bane of Hildeland, sowing circles of salt. 3 times 3 they circled the island, sowing rings of salt. It would reap a bitter harvest for the Finfolk. 9 crosses sealed its fate, torn into the island's flesh. The Finfolk cried out in pain and sorrow. To lose this island was like losing a limb. I can still hear the screams at night when sleep spurns me. Waking dreams of trauma haunt me yet. The island was lost, its magic shattered like glass. We could not return to its solid skin. The air-drinkers gave it a new name for its christening. Hildeland the Fair became Eynhallow the Blessed. Now new songs are sung on the island, and words that we dare not utter fill the air. But yet the magic lingers. The youngest son's hands were big, and he wasted his salt, sowing thick rings on the green grass. His brothers had none to spare, or their circles would be broken as well. So the 9th ring is incomplete, and some of the Finfolk's magic remains, mixed with the earth and stone. But the Selkies returned to our lost home, and they raised their voices in song. A lamentation of lost drifts to us from over the sea. Eynhallow, Brother Dagfinn's Lament. I sit and watch the sun yield to the ocean's cold embrace, cheered only by a flagon of strong ale. The young monks laugh at me for having foam on my lips, but did the good Lord himself not turn water into wine? He was flesh too once, and laughed and wept with us in our frailty. I am a small man, sitting on a small island a long way from the land where he dwelt amongst us, where I dreamed of going, but never went. Fearful of the ways of the world, I shunned the Holy Land, while murderers washed away blood and sins in Jordan's waters. He washed there, the kinslayer. God, how that holy river must have choked on his foul crimes. Sailors will murder each other when the ale takes their minds, and passion's spark is whipped into a flame, but for a Jarl of Orkney to crimson his hands in his cousin's blood, and a holy man too, as we all knew who saw him die. Jarl Magnus, the saint, made 3 offers to save the sinner's soul. Pilgrimage and exile were scorned, but cruel maiming Hakon accepted. Yet the wolves bayed for blood, and Jarl Hakon trembled at their howls. "Kill him! I do not want to die," he said. Bad conscience makes cowards of us all. While the wolves found courage in howling, they shrank from the deed they had demanded. Not one of those grand chieftains would tear life's breath from Magnus's lips. They compelled the poor cook to be the instrument of their malice, as he had just slaughtered a lamb for his master's repast. The hapless Liffolf still held the axe that dripped with the lamb's blood. "We have another lamb for you to kill," laughed the wicked ones, but this one was from God's own flock. Magnus comforted him, as Liffolf was also condemned by the mob. Liffolf wept on the neck of the man that he was about to kill, like a child weeps in his mother's embrace. I was a young man then, serving in Bishop William's chapel. The bishop stood by and watched this atrocity occur. He was no friend of Magnus, and ambition burned within his heart. I cried out, "No, this cannot be. It breaks all the laws of man and God." But the bishop fixed me with a wolf's eye and ordered my silence. Magnus prayed for his murderers and for his own soul. Then he bowed his head and took the axe. The lamb's blood was mixed with that of another. They refused him burial, as his blood darkened the soil around him. Then they drank and feasted, and laughter rang out over the broken body of Magnus Erlsson, Jarl of Orkney, saint. Once the longships had left our shore, we were left with bird calls in the twilight of that terrible day. The horsecock drummed in the grimlands as I went to get a spade. "What are you doing, Dagfinn?" the other novices asked. "I am going to bury Magnus," I said, defiant of Jarl and Bishop. Some warned me not to do it. Others also fetched spades. We buried him where he fell, a rank piece of moorland overlooking the sea towards Rousey. For my punishment I was sent away from Egglesey, away from the bishop's wolf eyes, to live a simple life of devotion and prayer. To a small island that looks towards the sun's end, I was sent as a monk, to pray for the soul of Jarl Hakon, although no one prays for him any more. Now we pray for the immortal soul of Magnus, whose body was taken to the great kirk in Bursey to rest. Miracles attested for what we already knew, and the patch of stone and rank weeds where we buried him has become green and bespangled with flowers. I would love to see it now, but I dare not while Bishop William lives. He was bought with a cathedral to house St. Magnus's bones, and he shuns those who knew where his loyalties once lay. Now my life draws to a close, and I reflect on all that I've seen, as I sit on the holy island which I have grown to love. Now the wolves who howled for Magnus's blood send their whelps here to be educated by me. You can see the lust for blood in their eyes. They will revel in death and destruction, and pay little heed to Holy Scripture. The abbot will be carried to Kirkwall for burial in the cathedral, or over to Bursey, where Magnus's remains once lay. It is the fashionable thing to do these days. But my bones will lie here, where they belong, beneath this green sward of Eynhallow. In my eternal rest I can listen to the song of the seals as they howl their laments for some great loss of which I know not. Their howls are not like those of the wolves who cry for blood, but are gentle and haunting, soft and kind. I love to listen to them sing on the shore at sunset, as I drink my ale and remember all that has been. It lies in my mind that this small scrap of land and rock caught between the swirling tides of the oceans was once called Finnsey, Finn's Island, although our books mention him not. Maybe on death I will know the mystery of the seal's song, and they will tell me. Eynhallow, Clara's Lament. He came to me last night, and I kissed the sea foam from his lips. How bitter and cold was that kiss! Then I awoke, and the tears fell like summer rain. The tears I have shed could fill an ocean since he was stolen from me. Yet every day I confront it, the place where it happened, and where my joy ended. The Eynhallow sound is quiet today, peaceful even, yet it has a hunger that no one can satisfy. No matter how many of our loved ones it devours, it still demands more. When I was a child, my mother would sing, Eynhallow frank, Eynhallow free, Eynhallow stands in the middle of the sea, with a roaring roost on either side, Eynhallow stands in the middle of the tide. Grandad would tell me how the Finfolk once lived there, until a brave man and his sons took it from them, making it visible for all to see. I wish that man had left it hidden. He had lost his wife, the story says, and now I have lost my husband, when the roost caught his boat and turned it over and carried him away from me. Oh, how we searched those shores, the living longing for the dead, yearning for them, to bring them home one last time, to cover them with earth and tears. But they never returned. No body to weep over, no grave to mourn by, wives and bairns alone and destitute, facing eviction now that the breadwinner is gone. Lairds and factors see no profit in people. No pity stirs in their hearts or moves them to charity. We will have to find another roof to shelter under. So now I sit and my heart aches as I look towards Eynhallow. There is no comfort, no future, although I am only 19. I was not wedded for more than 7 months before that fateful day dawned when we kissed goodbye. There's good fishing around Eynhallow, and the men know those waters better than they know their own wives' face. There is no danger. But the sea claimed them all that day. A terrible tribute it demands in return for its bounty. I screamed when the news came, not believing it could be true. How could he be gone, my young Robbie, my own true love? At night, I wrap myself in a shawl and sit under the stars, listening to the song that drifts across the water from Eynhallow. The Selkies sing their lament in wailing voices. ghost-like it quivers and fades into the far distance. Did I hear him? Did he call to me? Was it him? My heart told me that he was amongst them, just as the old folk used to say. A Selkie is the soul of one who is drowned, fated to swim the seas until the night when they can dance in their human form, but only until the sunrise forces them back to their ocean realm. I listen. Every nerve in my body tingles with hope. How can I feel hope? It deserted me on that terrible day. Yet I feel it start to stir inside me now. Can it be true? Can he have returned to me? I listen to the Selkie's song, and one voice rises above the others. It sings of a lost love forever sundered by death's cold embrace. It is him. I am sure of it. I rise and walk down the sloping ground towards the shore. The song grows louder and more beautiful. Come to me, my love, he sings. I cannot hear the words, but I know their meaning. I reach the shore and walk over the rocks, slippery with seaweed, a jagged ballroom, but tonight I will dance again in my lover's arms. The song is louder than ever now, rising and falling, a choir from another world, calling to me to join them in the song. I take off my shawl, fold it and lay it on a rock. I won't be needing it anymore. I am going to my new home, one that no laird or factor can take from me. Tonight, I will swim with Robbie. The water is cold, and my body quakes as I wade into its depths. The surge of the sea pushes me like a rejection. Go home. It is not yet your time, it seems to say. But I set my course, further and further from the shore until the power of the waves takes me and carries me away. The cold is like daggers of ice, and the salt water burns my eyes. They should be used to it after months of tears. I can't swim, and I'm helpless against the power of the sea. I panic as the salt water fills my mouth, and I choke for breath. But I will sing with you on Eynhallow, Robbie, when I'm a Selkie too. Our voices will mingle into one song of love, lost and found again. I feel myself pulled down, sinking into eternity. The sight grows dim in my eyes, and I see no more. A calmness soothes my soul before its flight. Robbie, I'm coming. Wait for me. Clara's family searched the same shore where they looked for Robbie just 3 months before. They found her shawl, neatly folded, lying on a rock. Then they found her body, seaweed tangled in her hair, yet on her face was a peaceful smile. Her father carried his little girl home one last time, while 2 seals slipped into the water and swam towards Eynhallow.